You sent me an email, and it had to do with a disagreement you had with me and my classification of Euromaidan and a lot of what ended up leading to the fallout from that, which, you know, has continued to accumulate into what we see today.
Let me just say at the outset, I'm not here as a Russia defender. I do not support the invasion of Ukraine, so I'm not doing that Norm Finkelstein position. I do think Russia had some legitimate grievances, nothing that justified the invasion. So I'm not here to, certainly not here to defend that. I do have some issues with your characterization of Maidan and what led to the overthrow of Yanukovych, because I do think that was also unjustified. I mean, obviously not as bad as the invasion, but I do think it was unjustified. And so that's probably where our disagreements generally lie, because from what I have seen of your content, you do support that overthrow, if I'm correct.
I mean, it depends at what point, because when you look at Euromaidan, it depends at what point of the timeline. At the start, do I support negotiations? Absolutely. But at certain points, there's lines that are crossed that make it very difficult for you to put the can of worms back, so to speak.
Okay, so let me just ask, I don't know if you've actually said this before, and you might have, and I just haven't caught it, but would you consider what happened at Maidan a revolution or a coup, or do you think that distinction isn't very important in this context or generally?
I think it's mostly used as kind of word games, because I think when I hear coup used, it's mostly not actually in reference to the idea of the Ukrainian people overthrowing their government in some way and replacing it with something different. Is usually used in the context that the United States went in there and did a coup, and it almost like removes the sovereignty of the people who were on the ground, who kind of made it possible in the first place. So I prefer the term revolution. Protest movement. Movement is probably the most politically neutral word you could use. But I mean, Euromaidan, revolution, revolution of dignity, those are the types of terms that usually are used in my circles.
Okay, and so the only reason I would characterize it as a coup, it's not because I think it's US orchestrated or Western orchestrated or anything like that, but just the standard definition that's usually given in political science in my area when it comes to revolution and a coup. A revolution is a movement that either involves or is supported by a majority of the population, and upon its victory, there are usually broad, sweeping, or systemic and institutional changes within the society. A coup is usually referring to a small coterie or faction of individuals. There might be some support for them, but not a majority. And upon taking power, it's just reshuffling one group of elites for another. And it's not accompanied by any kind of systemic or sweeping or institutional changes. And I think the reason that distinction isn't just semantics is because once a coup occurs in a country, and there have been econometric and academic analyses on this, but even just common sense shows this, that precedent then increases the probability that some kind of an overthrow similar to that will happen then in the country's future, which has implications and repercussions for the political trajectory and democratic trajectory of that country. And the next time there's that kind of an overthrow, it's not going to be usually, something you necessarily support, or you may not support the group that replaced the incumbent, etc. And I know there's this issue and controversy with the protest laws, and that justified it, and we can maybe go into that. But that's really where my opposition to what happened at Maidan comes from. And I do think there was an alternative that could have actually avoided what happened in terms of that unconstitutional transition to a new government.
So as for the distinction between revolution and coup, most of the time when I'm seeing for me, it kind of feels like word games, and it might not be word games for you, but for me, it a lot of times feels like word games, because I understand the idea of like systemic change comes after revolution and the majority of the people support. Well, again, for me, if I were to find it at the end of the revolution, if we were to call it a revolution, right? And at the end, I think there was a lot more support for it than at the start. Because at the start, when it was first happening, it was just like a gaggle of few protest students that then got brutalized in a certain manner, that then got more support for them. And the longer the crisis went on and the government was unable to resolve it, it became a protest movement, not just about, hey, this is about the association agreement and about the fact Yanukovych said that he was going to enter it and then pulled out in the middle of the night and we got brutalized. It then became a kind of a swing for, like in Turkey right now, is it just about democracy, or is it also about the fact that the economy's in the shitter now? There's a bunch of other socioeconomic factors that push people out onto the streets, and then how the government reacted then continue to compound the situation. And so at the start, if you wanted to say, well, at the start when it was not majority supported by the population, it was just a coup, but at the end it was a revolution when it hit the maybe 53, 54, whatever percentage point. Obviously we don't have like some live tracker for the timeline as the protests went on. We can look at polling as it went on, but there's not like some live as he outlaws protesting, now it has this much support or that much support. For example, the American Revolution, when it first started, it was not supported by, I mean, 1/3 of the population would be, I think, would be bold to say, supported the American Revolution at the start. But as things went on, it eventually became the American Revolution through the general societal view of the revolutionaries changing, or in this case, if we're talking about Euromaidan, protest movement changing. And so we can debate whether or not at the end of it there was enough support, or afterwards there was enough review backwards, looking back, where people now mostly in Ukrainian society view it in a more positive way. But as for the sweeping changes, the big reform, I think it's gonna differ depending upon how much is like big reform, because there's revolutions that happened and then kind of half-baked delivered, and then people were more upset, and then maybe there was even counter revolutions, or there was other things later that could start. So I don't really know if it needs to be so sweeping that corruption has been done away with, or we have cut down corruption 80%. But the way that Ukraine has dealt with public bidding on contracts, that's changed, and that saved Ukraine billions of dollars. The way their policing has changed significantly. I remember talking about a bad experience I had with Ukraine, and in Ukraine with a cop to one of my friends, and they were saying, Dylan, I know it's bad, but it's gotten so much better than what it was in the early 2010s or early 2000s, when it was simply as like, hey, we pulled you over, give me money, or I found these drugs in your car. While that isn't impossible to see today, the instances of stuff like that have greatly deteriorated. A lot of it post-Maidan, due to the fact that the government could not ignore the upswell in opposition to the status quo and corruption. How much reform has to happen before you call it a revolution, or just like a revolt, or whatever word you want to use? I don't know. We're kind of trying to find a line there.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of broad sweeping changes, usually the way I'm using it is when it's referred to in a revolution, we're talking about massive and systemic changes in either social property relations, political institutions, etc. I have no doubt there were improvements in areas like corruption, policing.
Would you say that if somebody has a revolution and then afterwards joins an association agreement, or tries to join with the economic union in Europe, could that not be considered revolutionary? I mean, economic integration with the Europeans would be gigantic for the Ukrainians. Same thing with visa restrictions and those being lifted. That would mean massive, massive changes for the Ukrainian labor market.
Right. I would refer to that as a substantive change, but simply joining an economic agreement that the incumbent government rejected or agreed to, then rejected, I probably wouldn't place in the category of systemic, sweeping, or institutional or structural changes. I mean, something like after the American Revolution, where they built up completely new political institutions and branches of government, or something after like what occurred after the Russian Revolution or Cuban Revolution, I would place that into that category. Now, I'm not saying, that it's not a good thing if the post government obviously clamped down on some of these issues, even eventually was looking to join the European Union. I just wouldn't categorize it in that way. And so
you would need like a complete government. You would need like, we're now communist, or we're now we're completely, the RADA's been abolished and we're starting a totally new system. Like was that something that anybody, I mean, I understand the idea that that's more sweeping, but in the way that I understand revolutions to be, if there was, say, like a takeover of the United States by an authoritarian figure, right? Let's say Donald Trump tomorrow said, you know what, no more protests, you can't do this, you can't do that, started to take all these actions, and then there was a popular revolt that overthrew him and then installed a bunch of new stuff to stop something like that from happening, and to improve things in society that led to problems like that happening. Would you just call that a revolt? Would you just call that you wouldn't use a word like revolution to describe that? Because honestly, the specific word that's being used doesn't matter to me all that much, because I could still think
Okay.
that there's justification for it, despite whether it's called a coup or revolt or revolution, revolution of dignity, Euromaidan. I usually just call it Euromaidan. Um, but I just don't see the Can you tell me the big importance for this to your argument?
Yeah, so the importance for the argument is that, first of all, let me just say, I'm not saying all coups are necessarily even bad. Sometimes, under some conditions, an overthrow of a government is justified, even if it's a coup. I mean, the coup against Hitler had succeeded in the 1940s. I think we both agree, good thing, right? I mean, there's probably other examples as well. When it comes to a democratically elected government, the threshold for when I say a coup or an overthrow is justified using these type of non-constitutional, non-revolutionary means is going to be a lot higher. And so, to answer just the question you asked about would I consider that if Donald Trump implemented all these authoritarian decrees and then there was a movement or something happened where he was removed, not through elections, and then there was a restoration of the previous type of political rule or the conventions or the institutions, I would say that was a restoration of American democracy. I wouldn't necessarily call that revolutionary. And the reason it's important for my argument is because I believe there was an alternative to the actual overthrow of Yanukovych that could have actually avoided all this, safeguarded Ukrainian democracy, and potentially even mitigated some of the things that happened afterwards. As I'm sure you know, there was an attempt by Germany and France to reach an agreement based on early elections, presidential elections, the withdrawal of the government forces from downtown, and the disarming of the Maidan opposition. Yanukovych agreed to that, but the Maidan opposition, or at least factions of them, refused to do it. Now, I'm not saying they represent all of the protesters, et cetera, but I'm saying if that trajectory had been followed, or if that avenue had perhaps been taken more seriously by some of the opposing forces, and I think by the United States at that point, there could have been a different outcome. And the protest laws were bad, but I actually would, I'm consistently saying that even with those type of abrogations of civil liberties, regardless of the national context, when we're talking about democracies, I would still oppose that type of an overthrow of the government, especially in light of the fact that an alternative might be available, which I think in this case there was.
So I would also say when we talk about Euromaidan, people don't say like it was the revolution where we changed everything to be good. That nobody talks about it in this way. Everybody, if anything, people talk about it as almost like a partially fulfilled book. You gotten halfway through. We were able to get rid of the I'll just the hat snatching Russian chess pieces, maybe, or however they would want to describe it. We were able to get rid of that. We were able to kick forward European Union membership. We were able to show to the political elites that Ukrainian people are more than willing to physically remove those who strike at them, which I do think is good for the political elites of a country to be afraid of their people in that way, or they behave the way Yanukovych behaved during much of that crisis, which I assume you don't endorse, and I'm gonna assume that, of course, that you're against all of that, but you're just saying that might still not be the best way. So,
Right, and I'm not talking about
let
the
me
protests.
just quickly.
Yeah, sure, go
It's
ahead.
it's
Of
it's
course.
there's such a thing as a failed revolution. There's revolutions that don't succeed in changing anything. There's revolutions that succeed in overthrowing the system, but then they don't change anything. They actually stay the exact same, and they even reinforce. And you could still call those revolutions. You could just call them failed revolutions, or revolutions that were like partially successful or semi-successful, whatever you want to call them. And in my mind, I think Euromaidan could be classified as a semi-successful revolution for the fact that they did make some sweeping changes when it comes to, for example, government contracts, which is the main way I've seen corruption done in Ukraine, which is the idea of giving government kickbacks to people who are your buddies. You give them a contract, they have no clue what they're doing. They do a shit job, and they skim off the top in major ways. By making those biddings public, that saved Ukraine billions upon billions of dollars every year. Now, that maybe to the United States doesn't sound like a lot, but to an economy like Ukraine's, billions of dollars of government funds every year, that's sweeping financial change. Now, you could say, is it completely institutional? No, I want it to be across more institutions. I want it to be larger. I want there to be more broad scale across the political spectrum persecution of corruption. There's more that I want, but I could say that it was a semi-successful, partially successful, even if it's 10 to 20%, that's still much closer than anywhere we could have gotten with Yanukovych. So whether or not it's revolt or coup or revolution, none of these really matter to my argumentation, because like the sweeping changes isn't necessarily, or that being the inciter of sweeping changes isn't crucial to my argument in my mind. Because I think that there has been enough changes since then to say that the power shift or the political shift away from the party of regions, away from Yanukovych's political party, has been beneficial for Ukraine, at least domestically when it comes to its political structures. It should, I think, it should go further. What was the other part of it? What was the other part of your question? The other thing you said?
I think I asked if you would have supported the alternative
Oh yes, the
potential
alternative.
arrangement that was
So
brokered. Yeah, at that.
this is at that point we're at the end of the timeline, right? Now, I'm not against negotiations in any way that could stop people from killing their neighbor, because I've seen war. It's bad, and if you can avoid war, I think it's good to avoid war. But we also need to realize that by the time that this deal or offer was seriously taken by the Yanukovych government, even though there were previous offers to negotiate on, specific, like, hey, let's find some solution, and most of those proposals were responded to with violence, and not just like a little bit of violence, but some pretty horrific violence. I've talked to a lot of the people who were there about, like nails and like screws being tied to flashbangs and thrown into the crowds, people beaten quite severely, a lot of the deaths that resulted, the gangs that were hired to brutalize them. I mean, it's hard to explain an equivalent in the United States, but it'd be like if you hired the Bloods or the Crips to help you enforce law in a city somewhere. It's barbaric. And so after all these different things happen, whether it be the direct police violence, the indirect gang related violence, the banning of the protests, or any of the we'll just say many other gross pieces of behavior. I don't need to go through every single like sex crime or thing that was done by the authorities. If you go to the end of this, it's going to be a lot harder to get these people to trust the government that just killed a lot of their friends and brutalized them for months and months and months on end, and to not only trust them to, stay on their deal, but trust them to be the ones to implement it. Trust them to be the ones to implement new elections. Trust them to be the ones that at least hold on to power, because it wasn't Yanukovych will immediately hand over power to this transitionary council, and then this transitionary council will hold election. It was Yanukovych. There will be elections, and then we'll see if, maybe. So in my mind, I understand why they made the decision they made, but also let's say that we went your way. Let's say we went your way and it wasn't too far, and they agreed to let the elections continue, and everything continued, and they had new elections, and Yanukovych probably, I'm just going to say, wouldn't win. Now, maybe it'd be somebody else. Maybe we would have avoided Yanukovych having to flee the country. But maybe Yanukovych uses it to buy times to allow the Russians to march directly into Kiev while working more directly with Ukrainian authorities. Maybe instead of just having Russian soldiers march into Crimea, their control in Kiev allows them to march across the whole country and reassert his control everywhere. Just like, for example, the Russians did in Belarus, just like the Russians did in Kazakhstan. And when I say just like they did it, I mean this is stuff they did in the last 5 years. So we're not talking about like 1950. We're talking about the same government that was in power at the time of the crisis did that exact thing during the energy protest movement in Kazakhstan and during the vote rigging protests in Belarus. And so
Okay.
I understand that maybe there was a pathway that they could have avoided him fleeing the country and maybe some of the end of the crisis. But there's an equally possible scenario where actually that just makes the whole state weaker.
Okay. Yeah. So I would simply say that it's possible that could have happened with that alternative arrangement and with those elections. Sure. I think that would have actually done a better job at laying bare Russia's true intentions if they had done something like that, because now you have the elections, the majority of the Ukrainian population gets to make a decision on their future. And if Russia flaunts that, they can't use the propaganda.
No, at that point, the game's over, though, isn't it? Once Russian troops are in Kiev, it's over. It's not a question of, well, now that they're in Kiev, we're going to have our democratic elections that are monitored by the Russians, that are maintained by the Russians. I mean, at that point, it's game over.
If they had marched into Kiev, yeah, that's a huge counterfactual. I don't know. I mean, if we could see some evidence that something like that would have happened, then I would.
But I mean, yours is as, I mean, I would say yours is as likely. I mean, where yours is, how would we know that your scenario would have worked? How do we know that the Russians would have abided by these treaties or wouldn't have done the same thing anyway?
Yeah, they might have done the same thing anyway. But I think there would have been time then to have a negotiation. And when you have these European Union countries backing that type of a deal, I think Russia would be a little more
Was there
cautious
not
in terms
already
of,
time for negotiation? I mean, what, like, to be clear, Russia had no right to invade based upon whatever happened. They could have overthrown the government and installed literally the most far right Ukrainian loon from Svoboda, right? And that's Ukraine. That's not Russia. They don't have a right to do shit. As much as people like to say, like, for example, oh, Crimea, there were so many Russians there. There's so many Russians in Eastern. You want to know what the election results were back in 2010 in Crimea? 46-43, Yanukovych versus Yushchenko. That's not a extremely like, oh my God, there's this huge gulf in society where everyone there wants to be Russian. Not even saying that, voting for Yanukovych means, hello, I'm now Russian. That could just be, he gave me the bag of wheat and I know how politics works in a lot of Eastern Ukraine. So
right. Yeah, of course. And there's also the things like with the energy subsidies. There was a lot of things Yanukovych did, I think, that were politically calculated that don't indicate he was a Russian puppet. And I think it would have, I mean, if the early elections and that alternative arrangement would have actually created a space for the Russians to march right into Kiev, I would be opposed to that. I'm not necessarily convinced that that would have been the most likely outcome if they had allowed for those elections. And it's my understanding that this would have, yeah, sorry.
Sorry. I understand I understand you not thinking it's the most likely outcome. I've thought about like what would have happened if he didn't. I don't see many other, because I think Putin's mind game is exactly how, or at least where Putin is where he said he is, where Trump says he is, where like he believes Ukraine's the apple of his eye. And so I don't believe that even a Yugoslavia type, we are a part of the non-aligned movement existence for Ukraine, was something that was really in the long game for Putin. I mean, he explicitly said Ukraine can only exist either as an extension of Russia or not at all. And you could say that that's just blunder, that's bluster, and he's chest banging or whatever, but he has put more bodies in the ground for that philosophy than any other revanchist in modern history that is actively pursuing that goal. So
yeah, sure,
I would say that in and of itself gives that a certain amount of credibility. That makes me think that this other scenario, maybe it even could have prevented a war for like another 6 months. But let's say another election happens and the Russians get an outcome that they don't like. Are they going to say, well, we respect the democratic will of the Ukrainian people? No, this is why I don't like all this talk about an election in Ukraine right now. It's not that I'm super against it. It's just that I don't think it'll change anything. I think Zelensky will probably win. And then all the people who are complaining about needing an election will say, well, fuck you. That doesn't count, because he's going to do the same. The reason they want him out is because he's tough on the issues that Ukrainians care about, which they won't be willing to concede on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, now conditions have changed so drastically. Even I wouldn't necessarily advocate an election right at this moment in Ukraine. Now, in terms of what happened if there was an election back then, I think depending on conditions, there wouldn't have necessarily been an invasion. If Yanukovych had won, or somebody who followed in his political footsteps had won, what Putin wanted at that time was for Ukraine to join the Eurasian Economic Zone as opposed to the European Union. I think he gave an ultimatum that it's either one or the other. Now, at the time, the polls show, I think, over 90%.
Okay, let's just be clear. You would consider that economic coercion, right? To say that.
I would.
Yes. So that was in violation of the Budapest Memorandum, which they signed in the 90s at that point, yes?
It is, yes,
so
absolutely.
The thing that incited the crisis was the Russians violating the Budapest Memorandum by economically coercing the Ukrainians by trying to stop them from joining the association agreement, yes?
Sure. Yes. So let me just also, though, add one point here, because this is something that's sometimes elided over. It's true that Putin did all of that. What he did in terms of the sanctions or the embargo, the mini embargo, is a violation of the Budapest Memorandum. In terms of what states do when they use those type of trade coercion tactics, I mean, you don't even need to be a realist to know this. They violate these type of agreements. It's not good. That was a big part of it. But the other part of it was that in exchange for joining the EU, Yanukovych was told to accept an IMF loan and also implement some version of austerity. Now, Putin matched the loan that was being given to him by the EU and the IMF without any of those conditions, the austerity conditions that accompanied the loan from the EU and the IMF, which would have included the elimination of energy subsidies. So it was the carrot and the stick. The cheaper gas prices plus that loan, in my view, is one of the reasons Yanukovych made that political calculation to not join the EU. Now, we can disagree with that.
I disagree that the offer was that good, because the problem is the offer you're talking about is what we saw, because by the time everything collapsed, we didn't get to see the full deal. They didn't get to create the full deal because it was already done. You know, the whole there was no the government in place now was not going to join the Eurasian Economic Union. So it's true that that was what was being publicly talked about as people were burning shit in the streets. But I would say that you probably wouldn't get into all of the more grisly specifics as people are actively burning shit in the streets over the very thing that you're doing. So I am of the fear that what would end up being done, and I'm not the only person of this belief, is they would force them essentially to join the Eurasian Economic Union with time. That this would eventually be not just, hey, you can't join the association agreement, and hey, you must accept this new energy deal, like they tried to do the strong arming during other earlier periods in Yanukovych's term and caused that energy crisis. This, sorry, I got distracted by something. Give me a moment.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, no problem.
Sorry, where was I?
About being coerced to join the Eurasian Economic Zone if they had gone
Yeah.
with the
Yeah. Sorry. So I got distracted by something off screen. It happens sometimes. I lose my train of thought and it just like crashes into a ravine. But I think my general point is that if they just accepted the coercion into the Eurasian Economic Zone, the eventual end game there is going to be the Russians having general domination over Ukrainian economics and probably by extension foreign policy. And as we could see from different ways that Russia's infiltrated Ukrainian politics, domestic policy as well. And they were willing to put physical like thugs on the street to do it. I mean, during the Euromaidan crisis, we talk about the Russian invasion. They had thugs going across the border in buses, literally busting them across the border before the crisis was even over. And so at a certain point, if that's what the people are being faced with, when the person promised on the campaign trail that they were going to, you know, pull out of, you know, go into the association agreement to show that he wasn't like what his opposition says, some Russian puppet, and do that. And then this flip happens. I kind of see this almost entirely as being instigated by Russia through their violating of the agreement. Then the crisis, through the people being angry of the violating the agreement, continued to escalate until eventually it led to such bloodshed that the population removed him with force before holding new elections. So
okay, it's a fair position. The one thing I would say to that is, look, you might be right in terms of your prediction regarding Russian further domination or full domination of the economy, domestic policy, had they joined the Eurasian Economic Zone. I would simply say that when it comes to the European Union, countries that join are forced to relinquish quite a bit of their economic autonomy in that agreement or arrangement as well. One of the reasons you had that Brexit movement in England, and while you also had the Eurozone debt crisis, which a lot of that was due to the fact that monetary policy is no longer controlled by those smaller European countries. And so at the time, I believe it was about a plurality wanted to join the EU. I think another about 50% wanted to join either the Eurasian Economic Zone or both of them. They didn't want to just join the EU. Of course, now the polls are completely in favor of the EU. That makes sense as a counterweight to Russia's invasion and criminality. But the point I would make is that there might have been good reasons, especially at that time between 2012 and 14, for Yanukovych to want to withdraw from the European Union. And politicians violate or go back on campaign promises and platforms quite a bit. I mean, in the United States, that happens frequently. I wouldn't say that. I mean, the protests are fine. You're allowed to protest over that. Does that justify what happened in the end? Not necessarily. And so I think the EU carried its own trade-offs.
Isn't this how all these revolts? I mean, for example, Kazakhstan, that started with energy subsidies, right? Well, when we talk about Belarus, it was one election, but it wasn't all just about one election. It was about all of the previous elections. It was about certain unattended to economic issues. I mean, yeah, it's not just about like him violating this one promise. It's about him violating the promise, doing it in a way to suppress protests by announcing it in the middle of the night. What made him do it, which was him caving on previous Ukrainian agreements like the association agreement, basically saying we will allow ourselves to be economically coerced in this way, and then the reaction to it with violence and what I would say were illegal banning of protests. So if we're going to talk about like illegal coups, if you take illegal actions to stop your people from opposing your actions, at that point you've kind of you're treating your people unlawfully. How do you expect them to treat you lawfully when you have the backing of the state that dictates the laws?
Okay, that's a good point. Let me just I'm going to answer that. Let me just say that in terms of the deal that was offered by Putin, the source for that is a foreign policy article that was entitled, I think, "The Loan That Started the War." It's also been covered in the Jacobin in a couple of pieces. There might have been details missing, and it wasn't fully fleshed out. Let me just ask before I answer that second point regarding the protest. Let me just ask this: do you think there were legitimate political calculations and reasons for him to back out of the EU deal that had nothing to do with pressure from Putin? I'm not saying that didn't also play a role, but do you think there were
I
legitimate
mean, like
political?
legitimate. I mean, I think that they're in the same way that there's legitimate reasons not to want to leave the European Union for Brexit, right? The idea of like I want
Right.
to control my borders, or I believe we're gonna save the NHS, or all of the other things that totally happened once Brexit occurred.
Okay, yeah, and I'm talking specifically about the austerity programs that were being demanded by the IMF and the EU at that time, and maybe a political calculation that this would be bad for his political future if he implemented some of the cuts that they were demanding. I mean, of
Well,
course, Russian coercion would have
I
played
don't
a
think
role.
that's the main thing. I honestly I agree that there is something about his political future. I think the bigger problem for his political future, Yanukovych's power base is in the east. It was in Donetsk, it was in Luhansk, it was in Kharkiv, it was in these areas is where they delivered him the power, right? It wasn't by gigantic margins as the way that people talk about it now, but it was by margins that were big enough that this was a strong power base. These are also the areas that are most economically integrated with Russia. And so when the Russians come in and they say we're going to cut off this amount of trade and this amount of and you can't travel across the border, you're not only you're just hurting people's jobs, you're eliminating jobs. You're unable to do jobs, you're unable to trade, you're losing so much economic potential that it's going to feel like a regionalized recession or depression, or it's going to have devastating economic consequences to the specific regions where he has his power base. Now, how devastating the economic consequences, it was impossible to say at the time, but certainly painful enough to, I think, make him decide, I don't want that, especially in the areas where my power base is. Now, whether or not that decision was wise for the whole country's national security, whether or not that decision was wise for what he promised, what the Ukrainian people wanted, or for the future of the country, because I think most people would say Donetsk and Luhansk now is in a worse place than it was in 2013 and 2012. That's another thing.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's going to be difficult to balance, exactly these competing claims and what really entered into his final decision. I think it was a combination of both. So I don't discount what you're saying, but I think there were legitimate domestic political considerations that had a lot to do with, or had some to do with, the type of conditions that were being demanded, which the new government
I
afterwards
just
implemented in terms of
Okay,
austerity. That
these
also played a
austerity
role there.
programs, though,
Mhm.
how much I mean, we see how much Hungary gets from the European Union. I mean, they are horribly corrupt. They engage in tons of, just public graft. It's open secret. The ambassadors laugh about it and take pictures of shitty public projects and post it on social media to giggle about it. Yet they are the ones that receive some of the highest amounts of EU public spending. If Ukraine was to join, one of the big reasons they don't want Ukraine to join is they're going to be the bigger recipient. They're poor, they're war torn, and even before they were war torn, they were still poor enough that a lot of that public money that the EU puts out there to try to bring up like economic equity levels in the European Union. I forget the exact terminology they use, but you get the idea. That money is going to be flowing
Yeah.
towards Ukraine. So I understand that there is a certain amount of austerity that would have to be engaged in. Probably just a certain amount of cutting of Ukrainian public graft because I mean there is a huge amount of corruption in Ukraine and even more at the time. So yeah, there might be some motivation on like, well, I don't like the austerity, but the funds are going to be made available to you by the European Union. I think kind of makes the point, uh, well, mute in the grand scheme of things, even if it is going to be somewhat painful.
Sure, but yeah, but it's also oftentimes accompanied. Well, it is accompanied by certain relinquishments in economic autonomy, as countries like Greece and Portugal. Actually, we saw that with the eurozone debt crisis, and then of course with
I don't
Greece,
think
you
that's
had the.
Ukraine's biggest issue.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I mean, maybe some of these considerations are more important. I did just want to highlight that, and that's part of the reason I opposed the overthrow as opposed to the other potential arrangement or agreement that actually could have been
Is
had
is there
that was
any
attempted to be brokered by France and Germany. Yeah.
is there any country that's left the European Union that it ended up like good for them?
Uh, the top of my head, I no, I'd have to look into that exactly in
I
terms
think
of
it was
ones
I
that
think the
have left
French
and that
left it for
actually
some
had
period, I remember, and
yeah.
they came back. and the British left it. And now the majority of the British think that was a bad idea, at least when you poll them. I think it's like 66% or something like that. Um, and I mean, now the vast majority of the Ukrainian public, you say it's the counter Russia. That's one point reason they want to join the European Union. There is also, and maybe this is hard to get across, they also do like the values held in Europe more than they like the values held in the Kremlin. They do also want to travel more westward than they do want to travel eastward, especially right now. I think that whether
Western
we're talking,
Ukrainians, especially, yeah. There were regional splits, though, regarding that. That's definitely true for Western Ukraine, to some extent for all of Ukraine, but there were those regional splits in terms of those values.
definitely
and
at the
that,
time, but these are
demand
things
for
that have
integration.
reduced as time has gone on. These are definitely reduced. Like English lessons is one of the biggest like courses all across the country now, because the way it used to work. I remember speaking to my old friend Dima. God, what is he doing right now? Probably doing something stupid. But I was speaking to him, and he does a lot of like crazy aid work, like pulling people out of the worst places you can imagine. And how he was raised was he was sent to the Russian school that was an hour and like much further away from his house as a kid, even though the Ukrainian school was closer, because Russia's where all the business is done. And you go to Russia, you go to Moscow, because that's where the center of business is. And to see that shift so quickly to, I mean, be English, it is a huge general cultural shift, I think, post 2013, 2014. But even before then, it was building
Yeah,
up.
and it's not necessarily surprising given the fact that there really wasn't a popular basis for Russian aggression, even in the east and central Ukraine. So, given that the conditions have changed, it's not surprising that there's much more support for joining the EU and for this type of integration with the West. I think that's predictable and understandable. Certainly, I'm simply saying back then, when the polls were a little more nuanced in terms of Ukrainian support for joining the EU versus the Eurasian Economic Zone, irrespective of Russian influence. I think it's a different story. And I think for that reason, an alternative arrangement is something that should have at least been pursued. I mean, the Maidan opposition. And let me just ask you this. You talked about the violence of the government forces. What is your position in terms of the violence about the right sector and some of the militant Maidan opposition groups? There are some scholars, I don't know how familiar you are with Ivan Kachinovsky.
I'm familiar with him. Yeah, I'm familiar with his work.
Yeah, I figured you would not be a fan. So I'm
not a fan. If you want to defend his work to me, we can talk about it, but I am not.
I don't have enough. Well, I don't have enough evidence to support his most controversial claim that the snipers
that the Ukrainian protesters all shot themselves. Yeah, George Floyd died of fentanyl. There's all sorts of stuff out there. Look, I understand the reason I hate that one particularly is this is something that is quickly shared. They read the article, go, whoa. And then how much credibility is in the paper, they don't know, because nobody looks at the paper. They just see the headline and then that's it, and then they move on, and then they have something to argue against Ukraine. But as for the actual violence that did occur,
have you read the paper or the book by any chance? Just as an aside,
have I read his book?
Have you read any of his work, like Kachinovsky's work regarding that particular claim?
Yes, I did, and I have. Well, we can get into this at. I want to get to the main point though. We can get into his work specifically if you want to, but. As for the violence of right sector, I've interviewed right sector people. I've interviewed them about their violence on my channel, and I asked them about like once this is all over, the type of what are you going to do afterwards. We used like LGBT people as a kind of example of this because their membership would go to the different pride events and they would harass them and beat them and assault them and stuff like that. That was something that was post Maidan and the type of street violence from ultras that is very negative and very societally toxic. Now during Euromaidan, I understand that there was some horrific instances of violence. Like, for example, the train union fire in Odessa is something that should probably still deserve further investigation. But even instances like that, it wasn't as simple as a bunch of people got like rounded up into a trade union building and then they got burned down. Even if you read the UN report that was really, it wasn't a UN report, but it was a UN review about the need for an investigation a year before 2022. So it was like a year before the invasion, because nobody talks about it anymore. They said the possibility of people inside having Molotov cocktails and all. We don't know all the specifics, but yes, there were horrific instances of violence. But also, we got to realize that for every like horrific, like disgusting guy you're gonna fight or in right sector that's like terrible views, and every bad different street ultra that's gonna go out there and bash somebody in a really horrific way during that, there was also a bunch of instances and 100% justifiable in my mind counter police violence because of the way they had been treating the protesters since basically the start of the movement. And eventually, at a certain point, after you get hit like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 times with a police baton, at what point do you say fuck it and you cut open a barrel, like a plastic barrel, make a shield out of it, and spray paint whatever fun, wacky message you want on the front of it? So I'll condemn individual instances of violence, and I'll condemn the political views of many of those who were in the street ultra movement, but I won't condemn the right for Ukrainian protesters to protect themselves or to fight back against the violent state that doesn't respect their rights or doesn't respect the laws that were supposed to protect them. Why should they respect the laws that's supposed to protect police officers?
Okay, no, I would agree with that when it comes to the regular protesters. In terms of the right sector, you don't think there was a faction that just hijacked the protest or used that as an excuse, but that wasn't their intention. They were trying to use violence for other reasons, basically to hijack that legitimate protest movement and try to overthrow a democratically elected government. I mean, you've talked to them or you've been there clearly. So I'm just wondering how much of
I
their
mean,
violence that was
I can't
initiated
I
was
can't
due to
speak to
trying
the
to protect
personal inclinations
protesters.
of each. These started as they were supposed to start as self-defense groups during the protest movement to fight back against police violence, and then as the violence escalated, the counter violence escalated, and then as the shooting started, they eventually got their own guns after they stormed certain buildings, and it was extremely, at the end of it, it got more and more and more violent. But it wasn't this idea. At no point can I see it was clearly right sector went out there and initiated the bloodshed in a way that was so over the top in comparison to what was being dealt out to them. That's not to say I'm gonna go out there and say it's for example, during World War II, there were a bunch of atrocities probably committed, no, certainly committed by American soldiers in Europe and other places around the world. But if we're talking about in Europe, yeah, they did some pretty bad things, but we also need to understand, like, what was the standard, what was going on, what was done to them. Do you understand what I'm saying? That it's one
Yeah,
thing to
okay.
say, like, it's really bad what happened at the trade union building. It's another thing to say, like, oh my gosh, right sector, they're far right, and that's bad because being far right is bad, and they're violent, and that's bad. You need to look at it the whole context. You need to understand that if you punch somebody, they're gonna punch you back.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. And in terms of, I mean, it's not surprising that the state used a disproportionate amount of the force and initiated the violence. That's what many states generally do. Now, in terms of whether that justified, and this can just bottom out in a difference in values we have, in terms of whether that justified the outcome of Maidan. I mean, there have been civil rights violations, I think, even just in the United States, that I think exceed the protest laws and some of that violence. I'm not even talking about Jim Crow, segregation, and slavery, but if we just take as an example the internment of the Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, when the
Yeah.
Secretary of War said the Constitution is basically just a piece of paper. If that had culminated in a similar type of protest movement with a similar outcome in violation of, say, constitutional rules in the United States that led to Roosevelt fleeing and being removed from power, is that something you think would have been justified based on the violation of those civil liberties?
I think, we're a little separate from this scenario because when we're talking about like people contained in a specific facility versus protest movements across many major cities, like demographically, it's very hard for me to imagine that Japanese Americans would seriously be able to do that to the American government. So we're a little points removed here, but I'll try to answer it in a way that I think is more connected to it. I think those Japanese Americans had the right, and this might be radical. They had the right to probably kill their prison guards and leave, because it was undue containment. They were put in concentration camps. And the thing is, in one instance, you could say, okay, you wait it out. But in another instance, what if they wait it out and they're not let out? Or what if now the state has complete control of them? What if they choose to get rid of the problem? Paying for these people's lodgings is very expensive. I think you can make a justification for them to do something like that, a violent action that could protect them. Now, when we're talking about major protests across every city across the country, right? It's then I think, if for example, Japanese Americans were in every major city and they were protesting the internment and then they got a violent response, this would maybe be, I guess the comparison. At a certain
Mhm.
point, yeah, I think it would be justified for them to overthrow the American government at a certain point,
Okay,
but it
and
would
in the
but it would need to take certain, like, for example, you can't protest anymore. We're going to load you up all into camps. I think, yeah, they have a right to do it. It's just a question of whether or not it's a viable or smart idea. I think all of the slaves at any point had a right to revolt. Whether that was the smartest move in any particular scenario is another story.
Okay. I think we may just slightly disagree there. And in the hypothetical, it doesn't just have to be the Japanese protesting. We can talk about their supporters. I mean, it's a little hard to fathom given the history of anti-Asian racism, especially at that time after Pearl Harbor, that they would have been able to generate that support. But just in a hypothetical, if they could have been able to do that, and you had similar protest movements in parts of the country, and you had some violent factions, and then you actually had a removal of the Roosevelt government through unconstitutional means, I think that would have actually created a more dangerous precedent for the future of U.S. democracy. Something like January 6th would have had a better chance of succeeding if you already had that precedent being
Well,
set at some time in the past.
okay, I
And
think
I
we've
just
gotten a
wouldn't,
little far
support
removed.
that.
The scenario feels a little distant because I don't know. I think maybe the farmers' revolt might be a better American comparison or something. Like we would have to find an issue that spiraled out into a more violent protest movement from our past. I think, but I think maybe we should bring it back to Euromaidan if we can. Here,
Yeah,
here's
we can.
here's
But
here's
sure.
my throw at you. Okay, here's my question. So we negotiate this. They don't overthrow the government. They decide to hold this election and allow the Yanukovych government to act as a transition period and stuff like that. How does this stop the Russians from invading once the next political crisis comes and they assert themselves like they did at the start of this crisis again?
Yeah, I mean, I can't definitively answer what would have happened in that scenario, but I think if political conditions hadn't reached the point that they reached, after Maidan, it's possible that Russia would have tried to use other means or mechanisms for influencing the country as opposed to an outright invasion, and even opposed to is in
But
opposition
they
to an
could
outright
have did it this
annexation of
time,
Crimea.
right?
They
I
could have.
mean, and like when we talk about 2022, it wasn't like the country was any closer to joining NATO than it was in 2021 or 2020, 2019, despite what Russian state TV might say. It was no closer. So
Oh no,
I
yeah,
just
for
don't
sure. But I
I
mean,
don't see any like flag that's like, well, this is the interest to Russia that's so important that if we just stay a million miles away from that, they won't do anything. Because I have gotten the inclination that if we back away from the flag, they'll say, great, this is much easier to capture the flag and keep going, has been the definitely from how Trump has been treated during these ceasefire negotiations, is definitely the inclination I'm
yeah.
getting.
Sure. I mean, in 2022, the thing is, at that point, the Rubicon had been crossed with the annexation of Crimea. They'd already used some degree of aggression in annexing that territory.
Okay.
You had the
Then should we
insurgency
start in
going on for
2014
quite a
then?
while.
Because if we start in 2014, why didn't the Putin government negotiate with them then? It's not like the lease had been canceled on the port in Sevastopol. It's not like there wasn't going to be an election. There was going to be future elections. It's not like they couldn't have probably found more effective ways to infiltrate Ukrainian society than marching soldiers across the border. I mean, maybe more money to the church, maybe more money this way, more money that way. But they decided to invade Crimea and then invade Donetsk and Luhansk, while denying it the whole time. And so I understand that, maybe they could have made this decision, but at every point they've made the decision to take the crisis, to escalate it and pursue the continual conquerings of Ukraine.
Okay, yeah, and let me just say, I mean, obviously, Putin was using certain events as a justification or rationalization for political opportunism. Yes, he could have negotiated afterwards. There was no reason why even fear of NATO should have actually triggered the annexation of Crimea. So that's a given. Now, if the Ukrainian population had voted in early presidential elections and you had a politician coming in that was going to try to pursue some kind of a balancing act between Russia and the West, which, according to the Jacobin and some other sources, Yanukovych, for at least times of his tenure, attempted to do just that. It's possible that could have warded off
Well,
a Russian
that
invasion
is we
and
talked
an
about. I
annexation.
brought this
Yeah.
up earlier. Is Yugoslavia? This seems to be the
Mhm.
proposal that is non-aligned, and this is talked about even today. I think very naively, but it's like this idea of a Yugoslav, a Tito type figure who could sit in that position and get the aid from the West, get the aid from the East, and sit in the middle, benefit, and the Ukrainian people can not only stay without outside the squabbles of these two empires, but can benefit from the fact that they want to, sway them towards their interests, right? That's what happened during the entirety of the Cold War with Yugoslavia until Tito kicked the bucket and ethnic tension said woohoo. So
Mhm.
in Ukraine's case, though, if what you're saying is true, and I do think to some degree it's true, I think he leaned one way in how it went, but to some degree it's true. He failed. He failed to do it. He tried to do it and he failed. And not only did he failed in spectacular fashion. And so
Mhm.
if the Russians either because they are not acceptable or not amenable to that scenario, or for whatever other reason, they weren't willing to make that deal with Yanukovych or make it good enough that it could keep him in power. For example, this middle of the night strong arming, this stuff that put Yanukovych in an extremely difficult political position to be nice to him. So I just, if this is the strategy to have this type of non-aligned future for Ukraine in 2013, 2014, um, wasn't that the idea and it didn't work? I mean, it's already written into the Constitution.
Oh yeah, I mean, at one point he decisively came down on one side in terms of rejecting his campaign promise to join the EU and then saying he was going to join the Eurasian Economic Zone because of a combination of coercion and some carrots, I think, offered by Russia in terms of the loan that was matched and the cheaper gas prices. At that point, it failed because of Maidan and the protests. And the protest laws were also counterproductive because all that they actually did was just bring more people out into the street who were upset that their family members or their friends were being imprisoned and being brutalized. So he also misstepped there. And then he was facing pressure from the West, the United States, European countries, and Russia to just put an end to the protests. Obviously, Putin's method of putting an end to it was different in terms of being harsher with the crackdowns, and so that, as you said, put him in a very difficult position. And I think, yeah, he was not able to do it. I'm not sold on the fact that some future government or some future leader might not have been able to restore some of that balancing act. It doesn't have to go all the way as a Tito in the former Yugoslavia. I don't think that, but I think certain policies could have been implemented and there could have been some credibility that remained intact without the unconstitutional overthrow of a government in that sense, which could have also placated Russian interests
I
to some
can
degree.
understand feeling this way in 2013 and 2014, you know, but feeling this way today after Putin has said everything he said, all of the speeches he's made in advance of the invasion, his historical descriptions as to why Ukraine, is his clay, and as much people go, oh, that's just the trimmings. I think he believes it. The way he talks about it when he's talking to Tucker is not in the way of here is my propaganda that justifies. That's not for Americans. What he said there about all of that, like nobody here cares about Prince Yaroslav's horse taking a shit in Kiev or whatever. Nobody cares. That was for him. That's for his sit down. Whether or not all that crazy occult shit Hitler believed, was for he believed it, and if he believed it, then I think they act upon it. And that compounded with, his belief, whether it be geographic demands for defense, wanting the Ukrainian mountain ranges so it would be harder to invade from the West, whether it has to do with wanting to dominate the Black Sea and having the entirety of the Ukrainian coastline, which the Turks are very scared of and is part of the reason why the Turks are backing up the Ukrainians. Whatever combination of reasons it is, for me, we got to picture into his psyche now we didn't have back in 2013, 2014. I understand stuff has happened in the meantime between then and now, but the stuff he's saying about history and and how Ukraine can only exist as an extension of Russia, these are things that would make sense back in 2013 and 2014 from the coercion he was engaging in, from the way that they were infiltrating Ukrainian society, from the way that they were engaging in alleged assassinations, the way they were engaging in all sorts of different infiltrations in Ukrainian society through the church or through, corruption or whatever it be. And so to me, that seems to be the consistency being whether it be through economic control of the state, whether it be through the control of the political elite or physical control through the military, Russia should have some amount of control over Ukraine in that way, either an extension or not at all. That one philosophy seems to be something that's pretty consistent.
Okay, so yeah, it's undeniable that there's this element of ethnic chauvinism and nationalism, blood and soil in Putin's worldview. I do think his worldview tends to shift a little bit based on what he thinks best approximates his ability to pursue Russian national interest. I mean, one example of this, I think it was 2002. There was a period when he was saying Ukraine's decision to join NATO is their decision,
Yes.
or something like that, right? Yes. Obviously, he changed his position on that later on. Now, was he just completely lying back then, or did international conditions and factors maybe shift so that he shifted his worldview a little bit? Because he said other things in those videos as well: NATO encroachment, genocide against the ethnic Russians in East Ukraine, which we know is a myth. But I mean, whether he believes that, who knows? Or human rights abuses
doesn't. No, I don't believe he believes it, but I think it's definitely I think he believes certain things, but I don't believe he believes the Nazis and the this and the that. I don't think he believes any of that. I think it's it's an old tune that sounds nostalgic to the Russian public, and people like an old ditty.
Yeah, certainly. There's that element where he's just playing to that type of mood in Russia. I'm just saying he says a lot of things at different points in time, and so it's difficult to actually say what his position would have been had conditions emerged or evolved in a different fashion, given a different outcome back in 2000. 2014. So that's the point I'm making. So
I
I
guess
don't know who knows about that.
let
Yeah,
me
go ahead.
let's look at the other countries that are in the Eurasian Economic Union. Let's look at the other. Let's like if we're offering this alternative ship, right? Let's look at the other people who got on that buoy, right? So Belarus, enough said. Kazakhstan, we already talked about the protest movement, how the Russian soldiers came in and suppressed all these people who were, I don't know if you saw the videos at the time, chasing down government forces on horseback, some really wild stuff. Or maybe we can look at Armenia, or maybe we can look at, I mean, we look at these states that have been placed within this arrangement, and it seems to either be that Russia believes they can completely control their foreign policy, as is the case with Armenia, just selling away their land, basically saying, oh, you can take that land there. We no longer need to defend it because, it's not really beneficial for us right now. And the Azerbaijanis just seem to be a little bit more beefy than you now. And the Armenians are shifting in kind. And so I'm looking at the way that Russia's treated these countries. And I don't think, considering how much anger there was on the streets towards how Ukraine was treated, that the eventual treatment in that way of Ukraine, which would come down the road of joining that Eurasian Union, would lead to anything outside of the Kazakh march or the Belarus march, or any times where these soldiers came in, they shoot a few protesters, and that is that. That's the statement.
Okay, that's a fair point. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying it would necessarily have been better for Ukraine. In fact, not even just necessarily. I'm not saying it would have been better for Ukraine to join the Eurasian Economic Zone. The only thing I'm saying is that there was some base there that did prefer that at the time, even though a plurality preferred integration with the EU. And in the context of a democracy, if the Ukrainian people overwhelmingly voted in somebody else who just says, look, the EU is better for us, let's join it, I'm all with that. And at the time, it was a mistake maybe for Yanukovych to renege on that pledge. But as I said, Democratic leaders tend to do that. Political leaders tend to do that quite a bit. Of course, there's that element of
let's just that we're talking about. It's like I remember the this, you know what this sounds like a little bit to me. This feels like we're talking about that law in Hong Kong about extradition. I don't know if you remember that. It was a big issue, and there was a protest, and Reddit, paid a lot of attention to it. It happened to catch the sale. And those people were, very brave. But if you would have asked them if it was about the extradition, it's not about specifically about the extradition. It's everything that's attached to the extradition. It's a part of a larger trend. And so I think it's not just about the association agreement. It's about what would come after, about what that means for the future of their relationship with Russia. Because, for example, it's what I said earlier about that undisclosed details. The details that aren't sold up front are not going to be the details that are good. They're going to be the details that are going to be what Russia really wanted, which it has to do with much lower prices for gas transportation, which means less money for the Ukrainians for transporting their gas to Europe, but more profits for Russian state gas producers, which is what caused the gas crisis just a few years before Euromaidan in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that specifically is what it's going to be, but it's going to be something like that. And when that happens, what then? What are the people going to do? Are they going to take it lying down? And let's say it could go like how it went down in Belarus. It could go down like how it went in Kazakhstan, very really quick, or it could go really slow and really painful, where they shoot a few protesters, and then the Ukrainians, their government is then overthrown with the Russian troops in the country, and now it's not battles of Donetsk, it's battles inside Kiev between weird Point is, I understand that maybe there was a scenario where we could have gotten somebody to try to walk this tightrope, but I'm waiting and I'm praying, but I still think at some point they're gonna slip, especially if the Russians every few years start shaking the rope with a new crisis where they're trying to subjugate the Ukrainians like a colony, which is how I believe the Kremlin views them. And until that psychology is changed, you're gonna run into the same issues, whether it be Ukrainian tank divisions or car bombs in Kiev.
Okay, so let me just say, yeah, I mean, that's definitely plausible, and it's certainly the case that Russia would have pushed for its interest in an alternative arrangement as well, maybe even very coercively. In terms of what the Ukrainians
wasn't this entire thing pushing for their interests? I mean, this entire thing was
economic
coercion for their interests.
Right, and I'm saying that would have continued irrespective of what the outcome of the early elections were going to be, unless there was a very clear Russian favored candidate who actually won the election. My understanding in terms of what the Ukrainian population supported is that 15 to 20% participated in the protest, which is a sizable minority. But even right up until the end, about a little under 50% actually supported Maidan. Now, maybe you know better. Did that change to a majority in 2014 before the overthrow? Because in terms of
I
what the
honestly, I
population
can't. I think
wanted, yeah.
a plurality makes sense, but the problem also becomes that certain decisions at the end, it happens so rapidly. Like the poll, it's like it's not like, hey, new poll, new day. You know, you wait like a week. They poll from like April 3rd to April 13th, and so when news is traveling so fast on a protest movement where bodies are hitting the floor, like before and after January 6th, there was a big polling shift for Donald Trump. Now stretch out January 6th to 3 to 4 to 5 months and have like major events like Ashley Babbitt dying every other day, and the polling is going to shift quite substantially. But if we were to go off of, let's just go off of your data for a bit and say it was a plurality. Now, I don't believe that the basis of a revolution's, how you could say, right to success, or its legitimacy, its key legitimacy, is necessarily just how much of the population supports it. The American Revolution was started by a bunch of fucking vagrants. Okay, these were drunks and radicals who talked like anarchists more than they talk like dedicated, free-thinking, like wigged up, philosophers who would bank rob, take over local police stations, murk the guy with a wife and kids. Welcome to the Republic, right? This type of behavior is how the American Revolution supported, and it did not gain them many early friends. But through
Yeah,
time
no,
and effort,
sure.
it was still something that built up. And I would say, even with the knowledge that you might have to engage in some behavior like that, I would still say it was justified because I believe in what the American Revolution was about. And I do think that the things that they were fighting for in Euromaidan, I think that they were right to fight for them. I think economic integration with the European Union is better for Ukraine than it is for the Russians. Definitely when it comes to the amount of just continual payments that Europe can make to Ukraine. Russia's wealth is dependent upon the price of the barrel. And you have a 1990 style Asian economic crisis where it's $10 a barrel. They're not going to be able to support their empire. And so if you're one bad oil crisis away from your Mac daddy, your sugar daddy, your person of support, your base of geopolitical structure from not being able to support you, that's not the case for the European Union. I mean, Norway might have some problems with its fund, there might be some like downstream effect, but Europe can continue to support Ukraine just due to how poor it is relative to where they are. The market, the labor market for the Ukrainians is going to be much more beneficial. They have much more access to capital in Europe and being able to send money home than they do in Russia. They have some access to money in Russia, but the money's higher in Europe. They have more. The dollars just go much further. It's part of the reason when I argue with a lot of my friends in the defense industry sounds so nefarious. But when I argue with them, it's like, look, I understand you want to build these things here. You have to build them in places where the dollar goes the furthest, where somewhere like Ukraine, where they're going to be able to produce a lot more, run it 7 hours a day, because it's just a fact that Ukraine can run it at a much lower cost. So this is something that I think would be economically beneficial for them. Before I even get into ideology, and I don't know where your politics are, but I do believe, whether you're a socialist or you're not a socialist, that a liberal style democracy where you're allowed to compete is better than a society where you have no civil society whatsoever. And that's what it is in occupied territory. So I think that it is one thing to talk about the legitimacy of one specific election and whether or not they crossed enough lines for the overthrow. Let's talk about grabbing onto the European Union actually as something that can lift Ukraine up. Their right to have that type of hope for their future and not resign themselves as just, something to extract by the Kremlin.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot of things there. So first of all, it's just one in terms of what makes a revolution a revolution. The support from the population, that's one ingredient. I mean, you didn't have that necessarily in the American Revolution. An interesting aside is that there's some historians like Barrington Moore who say that because the revolution didn't have that support and there weren't wide sweeping economic changes, that it shouldn't really be characterized as a revolution, that the Civil War actually comes closer to meeting the categorization.
Do you agree
of a
with that? The
revolution.
American Revolution shouldn't be characterized as a revolution?
I don't have, no, in terms of the politics, there were massive changes. So in my view, it actually comes close enough to at least meeting some of the key ingredients of whether or not it was a revolution. And so, building up new institutions and branches of government from the ground up, in my view, comes close enough to characterizing that as a revolution. I'd also agree with a lot of what you said about the European Union benefits to the population. It should also be mentioned, these are free trade agreements and arrangements in a certain sense. It's also true that NAFTA led to a number of benefits for, Mexico, Canada, the United States. There were also downsides to entering that type of an agreement, especially for a developing country like Mexico, when it comes to some of the economic implications and consequences, especially for its industrial structure or for its agricultural sector. So, I mean, look, it's a balancing act. I do think it's up to the Ukrainian population to decide that. I'm not here to say, you shouldn't be joining the European Union. I do agree with you that liberal democracy is better than the alternative, or if you just had those choices, the alternative of no civil
Those are the
society
choices
and
here,
some
though,
kind of
right?
public planning. Well, now, yeah, with Russian occupation and success of that invasion, yeah, that would be
What were the other
the two
choices then?
Well, I think,
I think it was
again,
always the two choices, really.
well, I mean, it depends on whether that counterfactual of yours would have actually transpired, even with the alternative arrangement. It's possible, and I'm going to say it's maybe even slightly plausible that something like that would have happened anyways. I'm not fully sold on it, so I don't know that
What
necessarily
would
would
be
have
the
been the only two
main
choices in
thing if because there's a long trend of Russia doing this exact thing. In Afghanistan, they used the government that was kind of getting screwed, calling for their support as a justification to move in. That happened in Belarus. It happened in Kazakhstan. Of course, Afghanistan is Soviet times, but we can go into other instances. For example, Finland. I don't know if you knew this. This is technically not the legitimate government doing it, but they made a shadow Finnish government called like the Communist People's Morons, whoever cares. And they said, well, they called for us to come in, so we're going to go in and, remove this Finnish government, replace it with communism or whatever. There's this long trend coming from the Kremlin. We'll just say that's center of power, of having this power within the country call for you to come in. You come in and you assert yourself, giving that person who called for you a power structure based upon you. And then if you, of course, benefit from the relationship, I would go further than slightly plausible. I would say it is plausible. It is plausible for something like this to happen, just due to not only the recent historical trend, but the long historical trend. And I know, like, bringing up something from 80 years ago, sometimes it's like, come on, these people aren't alive anymore. But I see Molotov's foreign policy in everything they do. When, for example, the restating of the position, where they just continuously keep saying a position over and over and over and over, that's classic Molotov. The type of, like, you agree to one thing in private, you announce another thing in public. We're back to like Soviet, like, geopolitics 101 here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, and that formula they use in Afghanistan of, basically imposing a government or heavily supporting them to the point where you can't tell the distinction in terms of autonomy, and then using that as an invitation to
Which
go
is
in and
also what they
invade.
did in Eastern Ukraine.
Sure. Well, it's what the U.S. did to a certain extent in Vietnam, with a Southern-supported government that really depended on foreign support to be able to survive, and then they use that as an excuse to basically launch what they call the defense, but which I think is more, suitably called a invasion of Vietnam. So I'm not denying that's been a formula that's been used, and it's been used by the Soviet Union, been used by Russia. I mean, there was a period after the fall of the Soviet Union where Ukraine was able to play this balancing act, and without overt, necessarily, say, Russian aggression. So, I mean, if things had happened differently in
During, like, the
2014,
assassination allegations and all of the other corruption and the thing with the church, or the Toulouse crisis in 2002, which
yeah, definitely. There were those crises. There were certainly Russian attempts at meddling. But in terms of a full scale invasion, I mean, if that is what you think would have been inevitably the consequence of an alternative arrangement in 2014,
I'm not saying it's inevitably a consequence. I'm just saying, honestly, I think it's more likely than the idea that we would have avoided an entire conflict altogether, and there would have been no soldiers crossing the border, and we could have had this peace by, if we were just to have somebody in there who could negotiate something else, and we could have kept it. And it's not that I don't think there's not enough concessions that could be made for the Russians to feel like they don't need to move troops in. I just don't think that the Ukrainian people would be willing to make the concessions that would be necessary for them to think that they don't need to have their soldiers in there to guarantee their power base in Kiev.
Okay. All right. I mean, we can leave it at that. I'm not fully convinced. Maybe you're right that it's more likely, but I'm not too sure about that. But this does segue into the one other thing I wanted to talk about, which is one perception in Russia was that this was illegitimate because of U.S. support. What is your position on how the U.S. handled it and how they intervened as it was unfolding on the ground? Do you think this was, unjustified meddling in
Euromaidan
it?
or
And
like
if you're,
everything after Euromaidan?
well, everything, well, no, leading up to Euromaidan and leading up to the actual transition to the new
I
government.
think that we were pretty lit. Oh, I almost used. I'm sorry. I was raised by. I'll say it. We were pretty limp-wristed in some of our behavior. I feel at the time, and that's not to say that we didn't have like any assertiveness. But for example, we were the ones trying to get the opposition to negotiate when much of the opposition did not want to negotiate. And when people talk about the Victoria Nuland phone call, which is of course very famous now, and I recommend people listen to it. I really do. You can actually hear a lot of the mentality behind the United States if you put aside the clipping and shipping and you listen to it in its entirety, not some to clip online. And it seemed to really be about how can they avoid some sort of massive Russian retaliation and response to a government which is seen as more conciliatory to them being removed, while also not just completely ignoring the will of the Ukrainian people, which seemed to be a call for a change to the status quo. Well, exactly what that new status quo should be, there seemed to be a general consensus that something had to change, that what was happening now could not go on. And I think that led to them pushing for honestly exactly what you were talking about, which is some sort of maybe not. It's going to be a Yugoslavia style or like in the way some Tito, but something where the Russians would feel no need to move in because this was a party that is not being shifted into NATO, not being immediately shifted into the European Union. We're avoiding some sort of physical force because America was not ready to stop the Russians.
Right. So I mean, I've listened to clips of it. I've read the entire transcript, but haven't listened to the entire phone call. And I think what you're saying is compatible with the U.S. position. Then they didn't know how things were going to transpire in terms of the outcome, but it was U.S. backed, not a U.S. orchestrated type of overthrow or coup. And there were some actions they took, which I think were provocations that
when you
led
say
to that
U.S.
outcome.
back,
Yeah.
let's just be clear, because I don't think you're trying to be sneaky, but people are sneaky with this because when people say U.S. backed, people hear things all
Yeah.
the time and they think, oh, the CIA went in there and they like shot a guy, or like, oh, then that means we moved a bunch of guns, or oh, we did. When we say U.S. backed, do we mean we gave some organizations money, they had flyers, or and they handed them out, or do we mean what do you mean by U.S. backed? Do you mean that we had verbal
Okay.
support? What do you mean by U.S. backed?
Sure. So there's a few elements. So yeah, no, the CIA didn't go in there and overthrow the
Like National
government or
Endowment of Democracy, like that's the type of stuff I usually hear about.
right. Not even the National Endowment. I think in the Jacobin article and in the Financial Times, one of the Ukrainian NGOs, it's called New Citizen, run by a Ukrainian billionaire, they received hundreds of thousands of dollars from US aid. Some of that money was then used to help start the protests up or to draw attention to the protests also once they got started up. So there's that. And then there's just the actions of McCain, Nuland, when they actually went to Ukraine and just stood side to side with some of the protesters. You can imagine the response if Russian politicians had done that on January 6th. And then there's the fact that Obama came out and said that the United States had helped broker a transition to power when Yanukovych was still in power, when they saw what was going to happen, and that his hold on governance was no longer going to be tenable. Now, if you take all of that and say Russia did that or Russian NGOs helped do some of that during January 6th, I think most people would be able to recognize this is, unjustified interference. Or even if you think it's justified, it's interference in the domestic affairs of a country. And I think in that sense,
I
they
believe
influenced at least the outcome. So yeah.
honestly, I think that we this is my take. We should have sent a lot more. Actually, I think here is the deep dark Dylan take. This is as radical as you can get me. My main problem is we didn't do the things people say we did. That's my main problem. Because when they engage in that economic coercion, when they said we're going to stop all this trade across the border until you stop going into the association agreement, and they started dominating Ukrainian economic policy, at that point it was due upon us to pay our bill, and our bill is fulfilling Ukraine's sovereignty to its fullest in saying that they cannot economically coerce them, they cannot take their territory, they cannot do these things as we agreed in return for them giving up their atomic arsenal. And when we took their atomic arsenal, we didn't do it in a pretty way. We said we will starve you to death if you do not give us your atomic arsenal. I know but that might sound extreme, but the way it was is there was legislators on the House floor saying we're going to cut off the food aid to Ukraine if they don't give up their atomic arsenal during the height of the street children crisis. And for those of you who don't know what that is, those are children that like went onto the streets and lived on the streets and sold their bodies and got really addicted to drugs in a huge crisis because inflation went up like 10,000% after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was in that state, in that moment, Ukraine sacrificed something for world security, for our security, because we didn't want to see those weapons smuggled to some terror group because some corrupt general sold something out of a back door or whatever, and then we're gonna find it in the World Trade Center and or something. You get the idea. So they made that sacrifice, and now Russia comes around. Here's the economic coercion, making somebody back off of their campaign promise to enter the association agreement. At that point, I think we had full right to support Ukraine in trying to counter that influence by saying, look, we will either, whether it has to do with the protests or back Ukraine in trying to counter that aggression, I think is perfectly fine. I also think that the support for the protests against the authoritarian backlash was also fine. As for the specific legislators going on the ground, I don't care. I didn't really care that much when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. I didn't really care much with this legislator or that legislator does this. I could say that, for example, Nancy Pelosi's visit might not have been very constructive. Was it good for diplomacy? No. They have a right to do it. Whether you could say it's U.S. backing, U.S. not, like these legislators have a right, definitely considering our historic commitments. Many of them helped make those commitments. They have a right to go there and say that we should be supporting them.
Okay. I mean, this might just bottom out in just some differences we have when it comes to underlying values and principles. I don't think the United States was justified in doing all of that in this particular case or in most cases. I mean, it would have to be a high threshold to breach for me to actually get behind something like that. And one of the reasons, of course, they wanted to influence the transition is because they wanted the guy who had, their interest when it came to economic policies in mind. One of the reasons they supported Yats, as Nuland pointed out, and with the brokering of the transition to power, that probably played an important influential role in bringing him in. And then you had the type of austerity programs implemented, which Yanukovych had rejected. Maybe on balance, you think all of it was fine and worth it because of Russia's intervention, but I think U.S. intervention in that form, and again, it's not overt intervention or a CIA-backed coup, but that kind of meddling, it just creates more problems in the long run.
I just don't really see. I don't think the meddling was really that consequential in the outcome. Because our meddling didn't really work the way we intended it to. The way we wanted it to work is we go there, we tell them to negotiate an election. We stop a Russian invasion while also getting a new election where somebody who's probably more beneficial to our interests gets elected. That's not what happened. What happened was they said, no, we don't want to negotiate with the guy who just shot all these people. We don't want to negotiate with the guy who just said no more protests. They have shields, they're burning stuff. It's time to go. So that didn't work out the way the United States wanted it to. And I think that's because the Ukrainians have their own interests and we have our own interests. Yes, the United States is selfish when engaging in the Ukrainians and trying to, get its own interests. I think recently we've been greedy to the point of self-harm in the way we're trying to bleed a stone dry. But I don't see how that necessarily either stops our right to either support organizations that are promoting democracy around the world, or, and I will use those words unironically, or I don't see why it stops our right to be able to have legislators go on the ground and say we support the people protesting against XYZ. Because I mean, the Russians do this in our country too. It's not like high profile politicians necessarily coming out here, but we allowed their news organizations to come out here and say a bunch of dumb shit on our soil and broadcast that to the world. We allow them to experience our certain freedoms and capitalize upon that for their own gains, even if it is against their own interests. I don't understand why we would be like, oh, John McCain, it's particularly bad that he went to the street, or I don't. And again, I don't think any of this was consequential. Unironically, I think it was the bodies hitting the floor that was the point of no return. And whether there was 10 million or 20 million or 30 million extra dollars to promote that, those images are so gruesome that they were going to get eyes whether or not this specific billionaire or U.S. aid package was delivered, or if John McCain went there. It certainly helped, but I think the momentum was already headed in that direction.
Yeah, I think, I mean, yeah, the US, I mean, they had different interests. And when they saw how things were unfolding on the ground, they kept altering their positions. It was true initially they wanted some kind of a negotiation and a transition to power, allowing Yanukovych to remain in power because they didn't think that he would be dislodged by the Ukrainian population or by those factions. But some of the things they did, I mean, you mentioned Russia doing some things in the United States, and Russia can never do what the US did in Ukraine because, I mean, the United States is just a massive power. It's not going to be allowed. But you can imagine politicians, top politicians from Russia during January 6th
Well,
going there
when
and
Russia,
standing
the difference
shoulder to
is when
shoulder
When we
on the
do it,
protest.
we publicly disclose.
Yeah.
Right. We file
Mhm.
reports. We list the stuff we're talking about now is because it's financial disclosures where we can go, we can read the documents, we can do all of that. When the Russians do it, it's like tenant media. We find out that a bunch of useful morons are getting paid a bunch of money in order to try to use their, platforms to pump out interests or like viewpoints that are beneficial to the Russians. Ukraine's the number one enemy of the world, like stuff that nobody would you say if you were, I don't know, a little sensible. So I do think the Russians engage. Here's an example of it. The Russians tried to organize Black Lives Matter protesters and pro cop protesters right next to each other so they would engage in violence, hurt each other, and have instances of racial tension that could inflame domestic issues in the United States towards the idea of us, beating each other, maybe killing each other, terror attacks, the idea of increasing
Mhm.
those tensions. That's the type of stuff Russia does off the books. It was Prigozhin who led those operations, a warlord
Right.
sent to increase racial tensions in the United States. So the Russians do engage in behavior like that in the United States. They're not as so bold as to try to actually support one protest movement to remove the American administration or have any money flow that specific way because they haven't had the opportunity. You think if they had the opportunity, they wouldn't try to overthrow the American government and have somewhere in there that would 100% benefit their interests?
Oh, absolutely. And what I'm saying is that that would be rightly viewed as unjustified intervention in the domestic affairs of a foreign country. And I think there is a bit of a substantial difference. I know everything you're talking about. The Mueller report pointed that out, and the conclusion they came to is that they wanted to sow division within the U.S. civil society or within U.S. politics. And one of the reasons they were doing all that, I think the U.S. Senate report said that as well. There is a bit of a substantive difference with leading politicians going and publicly standing shoulder to shoulder with the January 6th protesters. Would they have done that if they could and get away with it? Sure, but I'm saying that would rightly be viewed by U.S.
We're like
politicians
5 days
and the
away from
population
this.
as
We're like
unjustified.
5 days away from this happening, right?
Well, maybe we'll see.
But also, it's like
I don't
but
know.
let's also say, okay, there's also a massive difference between somebody going to our country to support somebody and hey, I want to overthrow the government because Donald Trump was the wheel winner because the bamboo paper. There's a big difference between that and I'm going to support these protesters who are getting shot on the street and they're being banned from protests. There's a huge gulf here, and I understand that from from the perspective, these are still foreign politicians commenting on the politics of these nations, but I do think the specifics of what the issue is, what the issues are, matter, right? I think that foreign politicians have a right to comment on the affairs of other nation states, especially if we're tied up in their foreign policy. For example, I will be critical of my government if when we send weapons to LCC and how he'll suppress his own population because is that commenting on Egyptian politics? Is that my place to say so? I don't really know, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, there's a difference between commenting on the affairs of foreign countries, which everybody has every right to do. Politicians have every right to do that, versus some of the stuff that actually happened as Maidan was unfolding, with politicians directly visiting, standing next to some shady, let's just say, politicians or figures.
What do you what do you mean
On the
standing?
right.
Like what did they
Well, stay
do?
shoulder to
What
shoulder.
what like
There was
what did
that.
they do though? What was it
Well,
that
there was
they did that was so impactful? Like because I mean I've seen John McCain stand a lot of places. It's not very impressive.
Right. I mean, I think when you have politicians from a major power coming and standing with protesters in that fashion, it does empower the movement generally, and may have actually empowered some of the violence when the U.S. government said, this is according to Kachinovsky, so I don't know exactly how much credibility we can give it, but he points out that the government at one point said they'd be compelled to recognize a foreign government or a new government if casualties reached a certain level in Ukraine. And he says that that might have then played a role in inciting more violence on part of some of the right-leaning factions or the right sector on the ground. I mean, he also points out that the overthrow itself may have created a more sympathetic environment in the east of Ukraine in terms of Russian intervention. It wouldn't have created the conditions for an actual legitimate autonomous uprising, but
And
certainly
what's his source for this? Does he have like the communications like filed or something? Does he have some like transcript? Does he have audio? What does he have for
I'd have
this?
to, yeah, I'd have to check his exact
Because
sources. It's
I've
from his
never
book and
seen
one
it.
of his articles. So, okay, really. In terms of which part the
I've
U.S.
never
government
seen
making
the
that
like, hey,
statement.
if the casualties reach this number, then we're gonna recognize whatever new government. Because I also like any new government, is it gonna be just like whatever is violently killing is whoever shoots them? Or is it
Yeah, no,
like any new government? Is
he,
it like a commission? Is like I'd be curious.
yeah, his exact quote was a new government, and I'd have to
A
go
new
back and check
government.
his source. A new government. I'd have to go back and
And who
check
said
his
this?
source on that. Catch it's in one of his articles.
No, I'm
Ivan
not. No, I know
Kachanovsky.
he wrote it, and I don't.
Oh, he
And to
wrote
be
it. Yeah.
clear, I don't give this guy any credibility
Okay.
at
Yeah.
all. But who is he saying said that?
It was been a while since I read that piece. I'd have to look it up again. I could send you the source when I find it. But again, I'm not. It's possible he's wrong about that in terms of at least, or his source is incredible
And
when he
also,
cited that.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
pretty clear that the deaths, like the first few deaths, were certainly, it's like undeniably done by like the government. Like
Mhm.
so I like the deaths and the body started hitting the floor from government attacks, and I think that's going to be when you start getting violent responses from protesters. There's a million different motivators that could have made the protesters react violent. It could have been, hey, a dozen is too many. You know, a dozen dead youths is too much for us. Some of them are actually minors. That we're not dealing with this anymore. It could be this has been going on for 3 months. 3 months has gotten us no closer to et cetera, et cetera. Now it's time to take more radical action. There's a million, definitely when you talk about Euromaidan, it's such a decentralized protest movement. It wasn't like here's a Euromaidan command. There was right sector, there was all these different groups. And so I think like all of them could have had different motivations for acting the ways that they did. So specifically pointing to like one idea that if it reached these many casualties, then it would. And if that is the case, then why the hell would the government be tying screws to flashbangs and throwing them in the crowd? Why would they be recruiting all these gangs to engage? There's a bunch of decisions they're making that would be counteracting against their interests if this is the case, or if they knew, maybe they didn't know, the government didn't know that there was a certain number, but I assume that they would know that the bloodier it is, the less favorably the world was going to view it.
Yeah, certainly. And the protest laws themselves were counterproductive just from the standpoint of Yanukovych, because they actually did the opposite of what the intended effect was, I think, which has brought more Ukrainians out onto the streets. So I'm certainly, not going to defend some of these actions by the government. If you have any questions, because we started a little late, I have about 15 minutes before.
How many more minutes do
Yeah,
you
there's
have?
something to do. 15 minutes, 15 to
Okay,
20
do you have
minutes.
any
I do
more?
have to
Well, if you have any more
tomorrow. So
questions, because I think, look, I understand wanting to find some way out of this, and when this was all going down, I was 13, right? I was playing Gary's Mod and Minecraft. That was my main focus at the time. So I had to learn about this after the fact, right? By going and speaking to the people post fact, and then seeing how the Russians have talked about the country afterwards. And I understand the want, and I want to have found some way to get out of it. I remember having discussions with my fixer from Donetsk about the possibility of avoiding this altogether if it was possible. But after so many times they have pushed it forward, after so many instances where I have seen behavior like what happened in Kazakhstan or Belarus and all these other places before, with all of the ideological statements and what I think is his actual beliefs, and I don't know if you believe that as well, about Ukraine's like historical connections to the Ruski Mir and all of these ideas that he talks about the same way that a person talks about their train collection with a type of vigor and joy in his eyes that is impossible to kind of deny. He talks about it in a way that is not really PR friendly, is a way you only talk about it if you're really focused on it. So I just see so many externalities that I cannot control for. And so I could see too many pathways where we end up right back where we are, or even worse off, to say that, okay, so I have to file myself against Euromaidan. Definitely when there was some societal benefits that you can still see today due to the consequences of Euromaidan, and the people are now solidly in favor of, the goals of the movement.
Right. Yeah. Certainly now they are, and partially that's because it's a counterweight to Russian unjustified aggression and intervention. I do think he has a realpolitik flavor to him. I mean, he says all these things. I'm sure he's disappointed that the Soviet Union collapsed, but then he also says he knows that's never going to come back, right? And he speaks with this flavor of ethnic nationalism, but he also speaks against things like what he views to be as legitimate security threats to Russia or a threat to Russian interests when he talks about NATO intervention or NATO expansion, not intervention, but NATO enlargement, NATO movement eastward. That's a different discussion. There might be some disagreements we have there that might take us down a different rabbit hole, though, but that would exceed 10, 15 minutes. But that's something that I, definitely be interested in discussing at some later date.
Chad, do you have any questions? Let's do that for the last 15 minutes. Chad, do you have any questions? Let's do that. We have kind of excluded them entirely. Use Kachanovsky. You don't worry about it. He's just some ice cream driver. He digs pits. He digs holes.
If you Google him, you'll find something or some of his articles and books. He has a book with Palgrave. I haven't seen him actually amass really convincing evidence about his false flag theory, even though he says he's well, I haven't read the whole book, but apparently he's examined, thousands of video testimonies and looked over the trial transcripts. But
with his diligent eyes, he looked over it so many times. This is the problem. I've seen so many people say things like, I wrote a book that's 2,000 pages long. I hear this stuff like that, and it feels more just like and I think about the issue. I'm like, God damn, could you not have written a shorter book? And this is more a test of endurance than it is about action. Like Scott Horton, 750 pages on Ukraine. Every single one of it's nonsense. Every page is bullshit. You've written nothing. You've written 0 pages on Ukraine. You've written 750 pages of Wattpad fan fiction that has the same, historical credibility as, some wet dream about Twilight written 12 years ago. It's nothing.
Yeah, I haven't read that. I've heard about it though, so maybe it's not worthwhile.
It's not. If you want to read it, you can, but it's 750 pages, and like I listened to him talk on Pierce, and he's stuck in the same conversations from 2014. Victoria Nuland, same stuff. Okay, Chad, do you have any questions before we wrap this up? Does the professor know that Kachovsky's paper on Euromaidan is not peer-reviewed?
So it's my understanding that what some of his papers are not. The book by Palgrave Macmillan, which has been published, is technically an academic publisher, and it's been peer-reviewed. That's not to say that I've heard many academics dispute some of his findings.
Mean? What does technically mean? It feels like a weird.
No, it is peer-reviewed, but it's not necessarily double-blind. When I published with Palgrave, I had I think one reviewer, then they sent it to somebody else for comments, and it is an academic publisher. With journal articles, I think it's usually 2 or 3 double-blind reviewers. It was blind when they reviewed my manuscript. I know some of his articles, however, are not. So,
okay. Here's a question: what do you think we should do now?
Now there has to be. I think we would probably agree more on this area, negotiations where the United States can use some of its leverage, but it has to come with security guarantees for the future of Ukraine. I would support a guarantee to at least not join NATO in the distant future. And I think Ukraine will have to give some of its land up. Now, how much they give up is going to be open to debate. And I'm not going to take a very decisive position on if they should stop fighting immediately or what land they should absolutely, just forfeit, etc. But clearly, I don't think reclaiming all of Ukraine is something that's feasible. I don't know if you disagree with that. Pushing the Russians all the way out. But I do think to avoid this being just a ceasefire, there have to be security guarantees from Ukraine. And I think the United States has made the point in arming Ukraine for this period of time since 2014 that they're not just going to roll over if Russia decides to do something like this again in the future, or if they just violate the security guarantee in the ceasefire. I mean, there have been costs for Russia quite a bit militarily, even though the front line is moving at this point, I think, west. But That's my position on it. I don't know if you think they should just keep fighting until all of the
Well, I mean,
territories reclaimed, because I
this is
think
the
that's
this is the this is
just
the
not.
problem. I feel like the framing here, and I understand this is how everyone's framed it, so I don't blame you specifically. But the framing is like, okay, so do we agree to this deal or this deal or this deal? And you're having this negotiation, and across from you is a fucking pit bull that's about to tear out your throat. Like you can offer him the steak, he's still just gonna tear out your throat. And as of right now, the Russians have done nothing, even though Trump has given them the best deal they're probably ever gonna get. Oh my God. Think of the luck they have to have jumped into this stupid, stupid war, kill so many people, do so much damage to your economy. And Donald Trump comes in and he basically is like, let's fucking let it lie where it lies, right? That's nothing. That's something Harris wouldn't have agreed to that. Biden would have never agreed to that. Ron DeSantis wouldn't have agreed to. I think there's a whole bunch. I bet he's like, I think the only person really that would have agreed to that outside of Vivek, who never had a chance. And so
Right.
for them to look that in the eye and then at every stage make Trump look like a moron by violating the ceasefires, agreeing to one thing in public, agreeing another thing in private, another thing in public, and we see them actively preparing for new spring offensives. I feel like that's why I feel like we're negotiating right now with a pit bull. It needs to calm down before you can even begin to think about, okay, should we make a concession here? Because right now it still is of the opinion that they're gonna take your son where they're hunting the
Yeah, and
civilians for sport.
I think part of that is because Trump is not very effective. They know they can get away with certain things with Trump there. Trump is fleeting. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be a durable arrangement, whatever, as positive as it might be currently from the Russian perspective, based on what he's able to negotiate. For them, you get a new Democratic administration, things might change. And I think they're probably aware of that. And they realize right now they can get away with the most they can get away with in terms of violating ceasefires and continuing the offensive, because Trump is in power. I'm certainly no fan of how he's going to be handling this, but I'm not necessarily in favor of the democratic position of just continuing to continuously arm Ukraine and fund them up until Ukraine reaches the outcome that they want,
Well,
best.
I mean, I am of the
And
opinion that the Russians should walk away with this thinking, what a failure. I think there has to be some amount of, these are the wars you have to lose. These are the types of wars, if you walk away feeling good about yourself and that was a good idea and you should do it again, this is going to be worse for your country. It's going to be worse for the countries around you. It's going to be worse for everybody. And so I think that they have to walk away with this feeling pretty shit about themselves. And whether that means 2022 lines or if we're very lucky, something better, but I don't think in the immediate future that's very likely. I don't know, but it cannot be a scenario that I think is easy to sell as a beautiful victory that they could then capitalize on to build more. Because if the Russian population rewards this type of behavior and it's politically beneficial to engage in this way, and the Russian political elite come to the conclusion that you enter a crisis, engage in a war, galvanize the public behind you, these are the types of things that can lead to downstream effects that are going to be more deadly than even if the war went on for another month or 2 months right now.
okay, well, how far would you take that? I mean, would you say reclaiming Crimea? I mean, is that something you would also like,
I
or
don't
you
think
just don't really
I don't
know
think the
where?
United States needs to make the demand that Crimea must be retaken, but I think the United States should be pursuing at the very least 2022 borders.
22. Okay. All right. So some of the territory reclaimed, and then some of them would remain within Russian hands. Probably is a feasible or practical
As
type
at
of
least
arrangement.
as at least as like a temporary hold until something more long term can be decided. Because I don't think there's going to be an agreement where you're going to get the Ukrainians to say, "Okay, Crimea is yours now forever. Donetsk is yours now." I don't think you're going to get that. I think the closest you're going to get is basically them silently kind of moving into position and accepting it as an pretty intolerable status quo until something that can be settled down in the future, whether that be with an administration change in the Kremlin, or in Kiev, or something else. And that's why, again, I think that a security guarantee is so important, which I'm happy to see you agree with, because in that status quo, the only thing that stops another war is something that would make it too bloody to engage in security guarantees.
Sure. Yeah, but I think if certain territories like Crimea are not just basically forfeited in a way that the Russians support the outcome, it's unlikely that Putin's going to agree to anything in the near future regarding a ceasefire or a security arrangement and a secession
Well, I
if
mean,
the
I don't even,
hostility.
I'm not even convinced that he'll, as of right now, agree to anything that doesn't annex everything that he's announced he's annexed. So like even talking about it, it's just feel like if there's a scenario where the like Ukraine gives up Crimea, gets everything else back, right? I think that there is a real scenario where the Ukrainian people might say, okay, right? Because I do see polling data that suggests that the Ukrainians would be willing to give up some territory for peace, that there's like about 50% of the population that'd be willing to give about some for peace. But then when you like name which regions, it's going to go down, 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 down. And like the idea of them annexing everything they hold on to right now is not supported by the vast majority of the Ukrainian public, or even a plurality, but like a very minority. And the idea of giving them the rest of the stuff that Steve Woodcock is currently saying that might be necessary for a quick fix, for really, it's not never going to be enough. So maybe if there was a scenario, the Rada could approve that, but I just don't see that proposal being made in the near future because I don't think the Russians are going to be willing to accept just Crimea
Okay, yeah. So
until they're
you
put in the position where they have to.
okay? I mean, that's going to be that could very well drag it on for quite a while, but I guess that can also just bottom out in a difference
I mean, the
in
Russians
values. I think,
just drafted the largest group of men in 14 years. So I mean, I'm
yeah.
of the opinion that the Russians are more than on the path to continuing this through the rest of 2025.
Right. And I think they're also getting more and more desperate as time goes on. And that's where I think there is a danger. And that's why I think that probably a little more than what Ukraine would be satisfied with might have to actually be sacrificed just to prevent that broader type of a security dilemma or a threat for the international environment. And that could be viewed as some kind of um, appeasement, I suppose, by some. But I think it's also just, again, a practical
Well, I mean, it
solution
would.
to
I
the
mean, it would be
current
appeasement.
struggle.
It's just you would have to say that the appeasement is necessary in order to maintain the global order or whatever. You would have to explain. It's bitter, but let's be blunt about it. What we would be doing is we'd be asking the Ukrainians to once again make another sacrifice for international security, just like they did in the 90s. And we say we would be there for them. Now we're asking them to make that sacrifice again. Now, I'm not saying that that's not the way it's going to go, but what I am saying is if that is what we're asking the Ukrainians to do, then we need to be willing to give them the type of security guarantees that's blood and iron. The type of US troops will be on the ground killing Russians if they enter your country again. That's the type of scenario that would stop them from invading again because we can't keep asking them to sacrifice their security, their land, their atomic arsenal, their for us, and we're not even willing to give them shit anymore. It seems like from our federal government. I know you don't agree with that set of affairs. I assume you would probably have a different approach on like the continuation of aid than if you were the Trump administration. But if we're going to keep asking them to make these monumental sacrifices, eventually a debt has to be paid.
Yeah, I just think, US, when we start talking about that kind of direct engagement as part of a security guarantee, that can get a little dangerous. I mean, I
I
don't
mean,
know
we
if
did it with
I
Estonia,
would be
Latvia.
on
We
board
now
with
did it
that.
with Finland. Finland has the largest border of any NATO country with the Russians. They literally doubled
Mhm.
our NATO border with the Russians, and the Russians withdrew their troops from the Finnish border. That indication is if they invade Finland, our troops will be there and will be killing Russian soldiers. This is something
Sure.
that would
And
have been
the
unheard of for the entirety of the Cold War. I don't see that being expanded into Ukraine after what they've done being such an outrage that it'll create the third world war.
Right. I mean, I just think with those other countries, and Biden even said that if Putin actually goes after any of the currently existing NATO members, the Baltic states, that the United States military will respond. And I think there's a greater credibility of deterrence when we were talking about countries that have been part of NATO and which Russia hasn't actually previously invaded. With Ukraine, it's quite possible he'll call the bluff, even if that's part of a
Then we
security
put the troops
guarantee.
on
And
the
I don't think,
ground.
right,
If
and
we
I don't
put
think
troops
he'll
on the
agree to
ground, then the
NATO
bluff he
membership.
would have to call is killing American soldiers.
And that's what I'm talking about in terms of, let's say he does call that bluff. That is what
And
I'm
he
talking
kills
about in
Americans,
terms
so
of a
then he's at war
real.
with the United States because you cannot kill American soldiers and then avoid a war with the United States, and unless you're Groiper's favorite topic about a U.S. ship off the coast of Israel. Look, oh,
Right.
Coast of Egypt. But uh,
But you don't
I,
see the
I,
problem with that spiraling out of control? What you
we
just
have
like
the
that
situation in
set of
Estonia
events?
already. I mean, this
But
is
I'm
the
saying there's
situation
less of a
across
probability.
much of Europe. I understand that by it not being the NATO deterrent, that it's viewed a little bit differently. But we have non-NATO U.S. allies that the world is very confident that if there was an attack, that we would jump to the defense. South Korea is probably one of the most prominent examples. I think the North Koreans, the reason they haven't invaded, big part, is because they know that we would be there and our gigantic atomic arsenal. The Japanese is another. There's a bunch of countries that are not within this alliance,
Sure.
and over time we've been able to build these relationships with them. And I think after how much Ukraine has sacrificed, how their relationship with us in the war in Iraq, how they followed us there, how they followed us in Afghanistan, it wouldn't be, I think, too difficult to make the argument, especially of assisted with real financial investment. That means we're talking about billions of dollars in investment into Ukrainian defense and the defense industry, as well as a deployment of a few thousand American soldiers, would make it pretty clear that it would be pretty impossible for the United States to decouple itself. And that is what we need to do. It's not that, oh my God, is this new Democrat in a suit, Republican in a suit, is he going to be able to convince the Russians that he will really strike them? It has to be he can't uncouple. If Ukraine's attacked, the United States is tied to it, and the Russians know it because we have too many troops, too much investment, too much infrastructure. They would have to strike it with any invasion. And by putting that crisis in place, it's not a question of what will the United States do, because they'll have to look at it through our eyes for a second and see that we would have no choice. And I know that that's risky, but that's the bet we've made through the entirety of the Cold War. That's the bet we made in Berlin. That's the bet we made in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, across all of Europe, and it worked. And so I'm asking for that bet to be made one more time in a singular unilateral, way between the United States and Ukraine. It could also be done with the assistance of other countries, atomic nations like United Kingdom, France, etc. But I don't see them making these types of sacrifices again if we don't put if we don't put our cards on the table.
Okay, well, I'll just end by making this one last point here, and I'd be interested in your response. I think one reason, if you go to 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, there was talk about just giving Ukraine NATO membership. Now, it's true that it would have violated some of the terms of NATO if they had joined then because of the insurgency, basically some kind of a civil war, but it's at the US discretion. When Turkey joined, I'm sure there were violations of certain provisions by Turkey in terms of being a perfect democracy, etc. Now, I think one reason the Biden administration wouldn't do that is because they understood that if the bluff was called, especially coming after the annexation of Crimea, the United States would now basically be involved in a direct military confrontation with Russia. At that point, you either don't do anything, the credibility of the alliance goes down, or you potentially push the end of the world button. And the difference is that Ukraine was a red line for Russia as opposed to some of these other Baltic states. That's my reading on that situation. I don't know if you have a different one, but I think that danger would still be here now because it's still a red line.
A red line in the way that Russia wasn't in a position to make the Baltics a red line when the Baltics joined NATO. The same thing
Exactly,
with Bulgaria.
yeah.
So when we talk about like red line, I mean it's a red line in this. If they didn't join NATO, then it would be a red line right now, right? And so it's not an idea of like these nations are integral for the defense of Russia, that they must control them, and there's no way that the Russian establishment could justify to itself letting go of these countries, because they already have, and we've seen them done it. And so I believe they could do the same thing in Ukraine if put in that type of a crisis.
No, because then Russian credibility is also at stake. They already declared Ukraine to be a red line. With those other Baltic states, you're right, but we can't turn the clock back. They joined NATO at a time when this wasn't declared. I think he's just written it off. It's too much of a risk. I'm not sure he would take that same.
But the problem is their credibility is going to be hurt
wager.
more if they continue to invade Ukraine, and enough of young Ruskies, young Ivans, get murked there that they're unable to sustain it. And through a lack of funds, or a lack of being able to continue the war, they leave with their tail between their legs, or not even because they were traditionally beaten in a conflict, but because we have, let's say, an economic downturn and the barrel goes down to $30 a pop, and they needed to be 70 for them to be able to maintain their current budget, 50, and they're hitting like the debt levels that they don't want to hit, 30 and 20, and you're in a crisis untold, right? And it can go lower than that. It has a history of going lower than that just in the last 40 years. So my point is that at a certain point, I do think that the Kremlin would make the decision that taking whatever they can take would be better than risking World War III, where they're sure to lose against an alliance of 1 billion people. And look, I know that those stakes are horrible, and I don't want to game World War III out, But if you have any hope of preserving your, and I think you're a Marxist, or you at least you are Marxist leaning, if you're the ruling
Yeah.
elite of Russia, the capital owners, you don't control and defend your capital through World War III. Your capital's gone. It's destroyed, or at least heavily,
Mhm.
heavily reduced to rubble. And so if you have any hope
Sure.
of preserving your capital, your life, and your interests, you don't go to war with an alliance of 1 billion people when you've been unable to conquer a nation of 20 to 30 million and all of their atomic arsenals. And so I think in that crisis, I'm not saying that they'll get away with nothing, but I'm saying I'm more willing to make them get away with as little as possible, considering the situation. I mean, they were the invaders, they were the aggressors here, they were the ones who created the crisis. I cannot help but allow them to fall onto their sword.
Sure. And look, I hear what you're saying. I just think it's a bit of a dangerous game to play. And I would say the same thing about US-Cuba relations. I mean, I've been opposed to the decades of attempted sabotage and meddling in Cuba by the United States. I would oppose China and Russia, coming in with that same rationale about trying to punish an aggressor and then drawing it out through arming
What
and making
happened though when
negotiations be dependent on Russian
we
troops,
invaded
obviously.
Cuba, and we,
Mhm.
let's just say, we didn't get an A+ on the report card, right? Didn't go bueno. Okay. Then what? What did we do after that? Did we
You're
invade it?
talking
Did
about
we
today
did
of
we did
days?
we did we nuke them? Did we, I mean, we, no, we eventually had to accept the fact that we had a nation state that was not that friendly towards us to our south, and we have a continuation of aggressive relations, but it has continued without another large scale war or attempt of sabotage or overthrow of the government. And so I just
Sure.
don't understand how it would be impossible for the Russians to survive knowing that there is a Western friendly Ukraine, thinking that there's no way for them to maintain their power structure, or the bet is it's safer to spin the bottle on World War III than it is to sit back here with our accumulated capital and concentrate elsewhere.
Yeah, okay, and I hear that as well. I'm just saying the way the Cuba-US relations were negotiated during the Cuban Missile Crisis after the Bay of Pigs as well is something I would support here. And certainly the United States had to contend with the fact that in exchange for removing missiles from Cuba, they would remove some of their missiles from Turkey. And to avoid any kind of a flare-up in tensions, they would then make an official promise to not invade Cuba again. I would support negotiations like that, but I don't think the United States back then would have tolerated any form of a Russian military presence or a Soviet
So
military
here's my
presence
question.
anywhere near
If
Cuba, right? Yeah.
I want to hear this though, because I am curious. You are a Marxist, or at least Marxist leaning?
I'm Marxist sympathetic. I don't support, I mean, he made political predictions which were false, and I don't support some kind of a proletariat dictatorship in Western industrialized countries, at least not the way he envisioned it. But I use that as a theoretical framework and a tools of analysis to understand class conflict as a crucial component of,
You
historical
use it as a
events. Yeah.
lens.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
So, through your Marxist lens, do you think we have to, if we want Ukraine to have leverage, we have to keep sending them weapons, right? Or increase weapon shipments? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, without US ongoing support, their leverage currently against Russia would, I don't think the Europeans can fill the gap if the United States decides to completely disengage in terms of financial and military aid. Maybe they'll be able to fill the gap for a while, but I think that would really, yeah,
And so, would
create
you also
problems.
agree by extension that it would be easier to get a deal done if the Ukrainians had leverage that could make something palatable? Because without that leverage, and as long as the Russians are demanding Kherson and Zaporizhia and all these big cities that they're not even close to taking over, that is just never going to be acceptable, and it's just the war is going to continue to extend upon itself.
Yeah, sure. And I agree that for that reason, there has to be hands-on engagement. And I'm not saying to withdraw all aid. I mean, I'm not taking again the full Glenn Greenwald position of just disengage, drop all aid, let them fend for themselves completely. There has to be some ongoing support along with negotiations to get an acceptable ceasefire and peace agreement with security guarantees, which I wouldn't necessarily say I would go as far as you are in terms of direct US combat and troops and that kind of a threat. But of course, Western Ukraine will now be integrated into Europe and into Western economies in a way that Putin did not favor clearly after Maidan. And I'm fine with that as well. And I think with some concessions by Ukraine, then there can be something that's generally acceptable. But I don't want to drag this on to the same extent, I think, that you might want to in terms of years and years, so that they could get the best
Well,
possible end
I
goal
don't want to
from
drag it
Ukraine,
on, but I also
but
believe
willing
it's
to
not.
do it, right? Yeah.
The thing is, I don't even necessarily think that it's a question of, hey, we got to carry this out for 3 years to show them we're serious. I mean, that might end up being the case, but making the commitment of we're going to spend $80 billion on Ukrainian defense articles over the next 3 years, looking down the barrel of that can be enough to initiate diplomacy today by trying to avoid the crisis of tomorrow. And so I'm more willing to say, hey, in order to both deal with the externalities of the Russians just continuing on without wanting to negotiate, which is how they've carried this out so far. I mean, we've seen the unconditional offer, and it was pretty clearly rejected. And in order to increase the leverage to get the most palatable deal that would be better for both Western national security and Ukrainian national security, we should be making large defense commitments for Ukraine and sending over aid, etc., either to try to initiate diplomacy now or control for those externalities. Either way, we have to make the investment.
Okay. And you'd be willing to go for, is there a limit in terms of how long you would want to go before something acceptable
I mean, like,
arises? Do you have any cutoff point at all?
openly, publicly stated for the open public position of the government should be, of course, we'll go.
Okay.
We'll like till the end until Jesus comes back. We will continue. 155 millimeter artillery shells are going to be going to Ukraine. That should be the open. As for what the private disclosed position of, where do we stop? I don't know if there's like a number on money specifically, like an amount needing to be sent over, or a specific amount of time. Because, for example, let's say the war continues to de-intensify. That what happens is that the shelling continues to go down, the amount of drones reverses and goes down, and then the amount it costs us to support them, it changes. It might change with time, but I'm okay with them having a limit to look, we need these resources elsewhere, so we might be willing to make more conditions than elsewise needing. In another scenario, we wouldn't be willing to. But I don't think that we're in the position of having a ticking time bomb coming to bust. I think it's the Russians that actually have the clock working against them. When you look at their economy, they're in a worse position than us. When you look at their defense production, I think they have less access to capital. There's more tools for sanctions still available for the Trump administration, which he openly talks about, that could be used for either secondary sanctions and other tools. And so I agree that there's a time issue, that you can't do this forever, and there's a limited amount of resources on Earth. But I think we should also remember that that's also equally true for the Russians. And if we come to the table always under the idea of fuck, man, we got to get all out of this table, they're going to take advantage of it. We see them taking advantage of it right now, and it could get so bad that it makes getting a short deal impossible. Because we're seeing it right now from Witkoff, him talking about, oh, maybe they'll have to give up Kherson. If that's what the Trump position becomes, they're not going to get peace. And so this want to just concede as much as possible could actually drag the war out, when maybe if they took a stronger position and the Russians would fuck, Trump is saying no Kherson, no Zaporizhia, take it, or 50 to $100 billion more. Well, obviously, if it was Harris, it'd be worse. Well, obviously, if it's the other ones, it'd be worse. We have to take the deal. So I think that way of negotiating is going to get more bang for the buck. You have to you either put your money and your cards and invest on the table, or you can't really expect anything to happen. You can't expect, as Trump is, to invest nothing, say you're constantly willing to basically undercut the Ukrainians, and expect good diplomatic returns. You haven't invested anything.
Okay, so that's fine. Let me just ask this finally then. For you personally, is there an approximate end goal? If this drags on for 3 years, would you at that point say maybe Ukraine has to cut its losses, or some of its losses, in terms of concessions that ordinarily or right now you think that they
I think it depends on for example, if it becomes a point where Ukraine actually has no manpower left, where there's a manpower crisis, but there are people who could still be mobilized. There are programs that are going on. I don't want to get into all the details about how many 18-year-olds there are, but there are still tens to hundreds of thousands of people that could be marched out to war. Potentially, if it got really bad, even you could get maybe 1 million or something. But the problem is those people are needed to work the economy. So that would require other investments from Europe in order to keep Ukraine afloat as people leave crucial key jobs in the industry. But I've had enough Bolt drivers to say, yeah, there's able-bodied men that could still hold a rifle.
Okay.
So I think that there's a certain limit, of course, but we're currently engaging in diplomacy in a way where time only affects us. And we need to stop that, because if we do that, then every other negotiator is going to just wait the clock out. And that's what the Russians are doing right now. We all see it. That's exactly what they're doing. What's funny about this is Trump actually used to talk about this. He used to say, it's so dumb of Obama to say when he's going to pull out. They know what he's going to do. They just wait. And now he's doing that exact, essentially he's doing that exact flaw in a worse way, by just saying very clearly, I don't really want to invest anything here. I want to kind of pull out all of the support here. Anyway, let's see if you're willing to concede. Of course they're not.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So yeah, thank you a lot for the discussion. I think we have some minor disagreements there, but nothing. I mean, I think that obviously Ukraine shouldn't be abandoned. That's not my position in terms of Russian aggression. And as I said at the beginning, let me just reiterate: I certainly am not here to defend what Russia did after Maidan, despite our disagreements about that particular event as well. So.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: Are you
Mhm.
are you less certain or as confident in the idea of, if we got somebody else in there, maybe somebody who did this, or we had this election, we played it the way you win it, that it would have gone that way? Is there any concern about the way Yanukovych could have played it? Because the thing that scares me is Yanukovych at the start of this war, 2022. The rumor has it, and I didn't see the photos, I didn't see the videos, but I don't know if you heard this, that Yanukovych was in Belarus ready to take the mantle as the Russians are marching on Kiev, as they're marching on the country.
I've heard people say that. I haven't seen direct evidence of it. If it's there, I would be very interested in that. I know he wanted to govern after he fled, and then he called and said that he is not forfeiting his position and he wants to continue to govern. Whether that agreement was actually made with the Russians or if this was something that he
I guess my question is: do you think Yanukovych would be would be unable to make, or you would be so confident that he would not make the call to allow the Russians to bring him back to power, that it is not enough of a concern to dissuade you from this being a much safer pathway?
I can't confidently say that he absolutely wouldn't have done that. It's
Not
possibly
confidently, but I'm
50-50.
asking you if it's a real concern.
It's a concern. I don't know. I mean, I'd put it at 50-50 maybe. I still think that the attempts to negotiate some kind of an early election, especially when you had major European powers behind that corner or championing that particular outcome, is something that potentially could have had a less destabilizing effect if it had been, more properly pursued, and if the Maidan opposition hadn't absolutely unequivocally rejected it, which at least some factions, the armed factions of them, certainly did that when that negotiation or when that deal was floated and became public. So. I'm not going to completely discount what you have laid out in terms of a possibility or the outcome if that had been pursued, but I do think there is still some legitimacy behind that alternative policy.
And one last follow-up question. And so if it's 50-50, what about the possibility of the following crises, of what happens once they're in the Eurasian Economic Union, or the agreement comes to the forefront and it introduces a RADA to, pass the Eurasian Economic Union, as we saw in Georgia, protests picked up once, the legislation is actually going to pass. And it's not just about the 50-50, because I think that you might be right that maybe they could have maybe Yanukovych wouldn't have been so bold in that moment, but it's the preceding crises after that point, when the results come in, when there's been a history of Supreme Court decisions that have overturned like rigged election results in Ukraine, and protest movements around that with the Orange Revolution. It's the preceding crises that makes it not 50%. Well, okay, well now the next one makes it 70, then 80, and then 90. And so at what point are we just kind of hoping that this guy can kind of walk a tightrope forever with the hopes of 44 million people? And I think it's not that I don't think that this one step couldn't have been done. It's the next day and the day after that makes me feel like we're kind of just kicking the can down the road.
Okay. I mean, there's always that element of political uncertainty. I think that, I mean, if the Russians really expose themselves in that fashion, and then with the next political crisis, or if the parliament had rejected entry into the Eurasian economic zone and Russia had just, opted for the military option, then in that particular case, it would have been laid bare again their exact intentions to use direct military aggression. And I think you could do a much better job at justifying U.S. involvement, Western involvement, and subsequent intervention to stop that kind of aggression. The way things played out, they currently have the ability to point to what they say was unjustified U.S. involvement, and to some extent, it was meddling.
Here's my
It was
question though.
orchestrated,
Again,
and yeah, and
at that point
unconstitutional.
though, I'm sorry, I don't want to. I can ask somebody follow up question. I should stop myself. We should wrap this up.
You can ask one more, and then, yeah, but then I do actually. Yeah,
It's just I'm just thinking about it. Like, okay, I understand that there was these monies directed to these groups that were very, helping with the protest movement. But then I think about just the decades of Russian like infiltration in Ukrainian society that would also easily be called, not legitimate, or they are not allowed to interfere in that way. And they've been doing that for a very, 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 very long time. And so the introduction of US involvement in Ukraine to me doesn't really change the equation all that much. In my mind, there's the possibility that Ukraine could get exploited by the United States, something you have to look out for as we're seeing right now, or there's the possibility that there's now not a counterbalance. Because a lot of times the way nation states like Ukraine stay independent, like in the way you've suggested, is by counterbalancing. How is the United States supposed to counterbalance without taking any action? Is they supposed to watch the Russians infiltrate the church, watch them infiltrate this, and this, and this, and do nothing, to the point where a U.S. politician of their own free will is about to fly over and we say, no, don't hand out a cookie. That's infiltration. As we see the Russians bust people over the border with baseball bats. It's so I understand your concern. It's just, for me, it feels. It feels like we're asking a lot of ourselves.
Okay, yeah, and I would say that, at some point, some kind of a balancing through U.S. intervention may have been justified. I just think at that point it was a little premature. And the difference, yes, Russia has done that. I guess this is me putting on my realist hat, and I'm not a realist, but sometimes the way they describe some characteristics of the international environment is actually correct. And there's a difference between spheres of influence at this point, right? I mean, the United States, since the Monroe Doctrine, has called the Western Hemisphere its backyard when it comes to meddling and intervention. Russia lays out this red line with Ukraine, is opposed to any kind of encroachment within their sphere of influence. This is how states have acted. And sometimes I don't think it's good, because I'm not a realist. I'm not endorsing that Mearsheimer view of the world. But there is an element of international security, as I mentioned. And some of what realists say when it comes to those type of international characteristics of the system are important, just from the viewpoint of ensuring the stability of the international system. So that might be one difference between
all more
Russia's
reason for, I would think, a Ukrainian protester to want to quickly, as fast as possible, integrate itself within the European defense structure, understanding that if you have to choose a sphere of influence, I know which one I'd choose.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, then we can get into, whether spheres of influence are just based on the population's consent. A realist would say it's more about geographical area and history as well. But again, I'm not a realist. And if I do embrace some of their arguments, it's usually just from the standpoint of international stability and general peace. And
you're using it as a lens. You don't need to justify yourself to me.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, that's my position. So yeah, are we able to wrap things up?
Yes, I think we should wrap things up. Where can people find your I don't know what I don't know what you do online.
Yeah, I have a modest YouTube channel. It's been a while since I posted it, but if you just look up the academic leftist on YouTube, it should come up. So they're able to find me there. I've had other discussions with some YouTubers, Vosh, Destiny, in the past. So,
by the way, what's your area of specialization?
I did IR and international development and political economy, but my focus was on post-apartheid economics, why they took a neoliberal turn after the
That's what I found. I found those papers you did about apartheid economics. I was like, what the hell are we going from apartheid economics to Ukraine? That's a hell of a jump. But
yeah, like I said, it's just, I'm interested in international events and affairs, generally speaking. I've also written some peer-reviewed papers on the U.S. military-industrial complex and military spending and its effect on things like the economy and profitability. So again, political economy stuff generally. But my main focus was on post-apartheid economics.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and you have a good one.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again, Dylan. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, that's over, boys. How you all doing? That was a long one, but I mean, I preferred that debate about Euromaidan to the Euromaidan debate with Lactoid.